Welcome to part 1 of the Aldershot Town Football Club compilation video for season 1998-99, in which you'll see all the goals and main highlights from the Shots matches that were filmed up until the middle of February. Of course, this was to be Aldershot's first season in the Ryman League Premier Division, but manager George Borg had been there before, and he knew that the squad would still need strengthening, despite the fact that they'd won the Division 1 title by an 11-point margin in getting promoted. That saw Borg adopt his usual policy of bringing in a number of highly experienced players in preparation for the step up in class, with 4 of them being in their early 30s and having spent most of their careers playing either in the Conference or in the lower divisions of the Football League. Obviously, some of the players who had helped the Shots to promotion ended up leaving the club before the season started, as Borg weeded out the ones that he felt were not capable enough of moving up a level, and the Shots' first half a dozen matches in the Premier Division subsequently showed that Borg had indeed made the right decision to bring in a bit more quality and experience, as 4 wins and 2 draws saw the Shots top the table by mid-September, while banging in a fair few goals in the process, particularly in the game away to Bishop Stortford, where Joe Narty scored 5 in an 8-goal hammering. Unfortunately though, this sort of form meant that some of their opponents decided to resort to some rather brutal tactics in order to avoid a heavy defeat, and key midfielder Simon Bassey had already been ruled out for the rest of the season with a serious knee injury during the match against Gravesend and Northfleet, before the game away to Bromley on the 15th of September saw even more problems, with Gary Abbott being sent off for retaliation after having his nose rearranged again by a deliberate flailing elbow, while George Borg was dismissed from the dugout again for complaining to an unsympathetic referee. In fact, Borg was even more annoyed after the game when he realised that nobody had videoed the match, as he felt that any decent footage of the incident would have swayed the FA into letting both him and Abbott get off whatever charges they were lumbered with. However, the occasional assorted cameramen who had been filming Aldershot's matches in recent seasons were more likely to be filming somebody in the crowd picking their nose rather than zooming in on Abbott's illegally broken nose, and unpleasant moments on the pitch were rarely captured on film in order to be used as vital evidence. So that's when Hughes Video Services were brought in, having worked with Borg for a number of years at his former club Enfield, with our first Aldershot Town fixture being at home to 4th place Sutton United the following Saturday. 2 changes were made to the side that gained the 1-1 draw at Bromley, with Simon Stapleton and Lee Endersby coming in for Colin Fielder and Neil Champion, who were both named as substitutes, along with the Shots' top goalscorer from the previous season, Roy Young. In fact, apart from a League Cup tie at Hitchin, Young had started every match on the bench so far due to the excellent form of Gary Abbott and Joe Narty, who were both averaging slightly over a goal a game. And with most of their teammates also performing well in George Borg's preferred 4-4-2 formation, it was a squad which looked quite capable of staying at the top of the table for the rest of the season. However, Sutton United were undoubtedly one of Aldershot's main challengers for the title, as they'd consistently been one of the top half a dozen sides in the Premier Division for a number of seasons, and they showed their class in taking the lead after only 5 minutes, as Mark Watson slid in to convert Nazi Macrao's cross from close range, with the Shots' defence looking far too slow all round. In fact, Aldershot were lucky not to find themselves 2-0 down just a minute later, when Jason Chewins failed to cut out a through ball from Macrao, which eventually enabled Watson to get in another shot at goal, which Gary Phillips this time managed to block at his near post. In general, the Shots had been defending quite well during the season so far, although they did let in 3 in their previous home match, and the crowd was certainly starting to get a bit agitated when Sutton had yet another clear-cut chance from the resulting corner, but thankfully Enko Ikoku wasted it with a feeble-looking flick, which enabled Gary Phillips to make a scrambled save, albeit with the help of the foot of the post. However, it wasn't long before the informed Joe Narty came to life up the other end, as he managed Aldershot's first decent shot of the match in the 8th minute, but Sutton keeper Gareth Howells was always well behind it. Howells was definitely at fault when Aldershot equalised though, as he was tempted into coming too far off his line to claim Lee Endersby's deep cross, and was left stranded way out of his goal as Jimmy Segru and Joe Narty headed the ball back for Gary Abbott to volley in. With that goal coming after only 11 minutes, it had been an amazing start to the match with chances galore, although most of them had fallen to Sutton, and they could even have regained the lead just 2 minutes later when Nazi Macrao was left unmarked on the edge of the 6-yard box, but could only hook the ball over the bar when it looked easier to score. With this being a top-of-the-table match, you maybe would have expected both sides to be very tight defensively, but it seemed that neither defence could cope with the amount of quality strikers on view, and it was the Narty and Abbott combination which almost led to Aldershot taking the lead in the 16th minute, when Narty's clever back heel set up Abbott for a first-time shot, which forced keeper Howells into a reasonable save. However, Gary Phillips had to make a much more difficult save at the other end just a minute later, when Nazi Macrae got in a shot on target from 6 yards this time after a scramble in the area from Richard Skelly's cross, but Phillips somehow managed to block it from point-blank range before diving on the loose ball. In fact, Sutton was still looking the better side despite Aldershot equalising, and it was their attacking formation of what was more or less a 4-2-4 system that was making the Shots' defence look so ragged, with wide players Andy Salako and Nenko Ikoku looking far more potent than their more famous brothers are nowadays, and they combined to put Sutton back in front in the 24th minute as Salako's deflected cross found Ikoku at the far post, who even had time to slightly miscontrol the ball before firing it home. With Sutton's defence not looking too comfortable either though, Aldershot were by no means out of it yet, and indeed they were presented with a good chance to make it 2-2 just a couple of minutes later, as Sutton tried to play the not interfering Joe Narty offside from Jason Chewin's long clearance, leaving Jimmy Segru with a clear run on goal, but he rather scuffed his shot and allowed keeper Howells to make the save. Once again though, as soon as Aldershot managed a shot on goal, Sutton answered back by creating an even better chance, even though on this occasion it was a full 10 minutes afterwards that Terry Howard allowed Mark Watson to get goal side of him from Nazi Macrae's flick on, but not for the first time. Gary Phillips came to the rescue with a good point blank save before Jason Chewins cleared the rebound. Aldershot then had even more problems to contend with in the 39th minute when Jimmy Segru, who'd been their best player in the match so far, had to be replaced because of an injury, although whether the change to a 3-5-2 formation on Colin Fielder's introduction was a deliberate tactical change or an enforced one, only George Borg will know. It certainly seemed to work for the rest of the half though, as Aldershot had the only other chance before the break, as Gary Abbott suddenly found himself in the now departed Segru's position to get over a cross, which Joe Narty couldn't quite direct on target, as keeper Howells came flying towards him. Not surprisingly, after such an open and entertaining first 45 minutes, both managers appeared to concentrate on tightening up their defences during the half-time interval, with Sutton's John Raines no doubt hoping to hang on to their lead, and George Borg continuing with Colin Fielder playing as a sweeper to cover all the mistakes that Terry Howard and Mark Harper had been making. In fact, there had hardly been a foul in the first half either, but referee Steve Tomlin did have to get the yellow card out in the 53rd minute, although that was for an incident which gave the crowd some amusement as well, with Lee Endersby not surprisingly being booked for taking a pot shot at a linesman after being penalised for handball. As for actual goal chances, the first one of the second half didn't come until the 64th minute, but Sutton keeper Gareth Howells wasn't threatened because Gary Abbott completely missed his kick right in front of goal from Lee Endersby's low cross. At least Aldershot had been defending a lot better after the break, but so had Sutton, and despite George Borg bringing on forward Roy Young for defender Mark Harper in switching to a 3-4-3 formation, the Shots failed to manage a single shot on target for the rest of the match, with this low cross shot from Lee Endersby in the 84th minute being their best effort of the second half. In fact, Sutton could well have increased their lead in the 86th minute as they forced a corner after a rare break from defence, and that led to Steve Watson getting in a well-struck shot which forced Gary Phillips into his 5th good save of the match. In the end then, Aldershot were a bit lucky not to have suffered a heavier defeat against a side who were by far the best team they'd played this season so far, and to be fair, the Aldershot supporters recognised that fact with some generous applause on the final whistle, even though they'd just seen their team lose at home for the first time in a competitive match since the 13th of December 1997. Unfortunately, that result meant that Sutton had now taken over from the Shots at the top of the table, so it was important to bounce back the following Tuesday night at home to 9th place St Albans City. Once again, manager George Borg made two changes to his starting line-up, with Colin Fielder and Neil Champion returning in place of Lee Endersby and the injured Jimmy Segru. The reason for Endersby's omission obviously being Borg's decision to go with a 3-5-2 formation in order to tighten up at the back, especially with Fielder being a highly capable sweeper and Champion being a very competitive midfielder. Not surprisingly, that enabled Aldershot to deny St Albans a shot at goal until the 28th minute, but when it came it ended up in the back of Gary Phillips' net, as midfielder Lenny Piper rifled in a swerving shot from the edge of the area after the shots had lost their concentration from a quickly taken free kick. With St Albans having had a disappointing start to their season, manager Gary Hill had also decided to keep it tight at the back in this match, but those tactics backfired on him as well when Aldershot equalised just 2 minutes later, when after a succession of corners, one of them eventually fell into the path of Neil Champion, who scored his first goal for the club with a first-time shot, which obviously took a deflection off somebody. Despite the scoreline though, chances were few and far between in the first half, and it was nothing like the first 45 minutes in the previous home match against Sutton, although Aldershot were unlucky not to go 2-1 up in the 37th minute when Colin Fielder hit the post after an indirect free kick had been laid off to him. But Joe Narty then blasted the rebound over the bar with keeper Paul Newell still on the floor. However, St Albans also had a good chance to go in front just before the break when the prolific scoring Steve Clark was left unmarked from a Matt Jones cross, but mistimed his header over the bar with his strike partner Rob Hayworth in an even better position right behind him. With St Albans also having spent a lot of money during the summer to improve their squad, a close game was always on the cards, and 1-1 was certainly a fair half-time scoreline on the balance of play. But St Albans did put the Shots' defence under pressure early in the second half, and Gary Phillips was forced into making an excellent save in the 51st minute to keep out Steve Clark's overhead kick. However, apart from that, the first 20 minutes or so of the second half continued to be largely uneventful, despite George Borg bringing on Roy Young again after an hour's play and switching to a 3-4-3. And in fact, that change in tactics only went and hindered Aldershot in the 72nd minute, as their midfield holding player Neil Champion would have stopped St Albans' Lenny Piper from running through on goal after Simon Stapleton had stumbled over the ball. But with Champion having been substituted for Young's introduction, Piper was left with plenty of space to run on and send a shot into the bottom corner to put his side 2-1 up. It was a dreadful mistake from Stapleton though, and a large number of home supporters obviously expected better than that from the amount of stick they were giving him. But he wasn't the only Aldershot player having an off day, as defender Gary Smart lost his concentration in the 80th minute in allowing Rob Hayworth to get away from him, and he was lucky that Hayworth allowed him to get back and make a vital challenge. However, Aldershot were unlucky not to equalise in the 82nd minute when Joe Narty outjumped keeper Newell from a Roy Young cross, but defender Mark Keane managed to clear off the line. That proved to be Aldershot's last real chance though, as St Albans time wasted effectively enough to hang on for a victory which was just about deserved, and with this being their second home defeat in a row, the Shots now knew that this division was a lot stronger than it had seemed after their first 7 matches. In fact, 4 of the sides they faced in that 7-match unbeaten run eventually turned out to be just about the weakest sides in the division. But at least Aldershot knew what to expect from their next opponents, as Billericay Town had been promoted from Division 1 with them. Despite the poor performance against St Albans though, George Borg decided to give his players a chance to redeem themselves by keeping an unchanged starting line-up and the same 3-5-2 formation. But he had made a couple of new signings in winger Ian Hathaway, another vastly experienced Football League player in his early 30s, and 21-year-old midfielder Kieran Philpott, who had impressed in training after playing for the British Universities side the previous season. So they were both named on the substitutes bench. With Hathaway having been brought in on loan from a Football League club though, namely Colchester United, the normal practice in these instances when a player drops down to a non-league club is for them to be put into the starting lineup straight away because of their extra experience. And when Billericay took the lead after only 2 minutes, Borg may well have been wondering if he'd made the right decision to leave him on the bench, although David Adekola's strike from well outside the area was a bit of a wonder effort, and Aldershot were really just unlucky to be on the receiving end. However, Billericay were in good form anyway, as they were above Aldershot in the table in second place after an unbeaten run of 6 matches in which they'd only conceded 2 goals. And with manager John Kendall fielding an unchanged side for this match, it was obvious that they would provide just as stern a test as Sutton and St Albans had, and indeed Aldershot looked rattled again in the 14th minute when skipper Mark Harper was not surprisingly booked for a bad foul on Billericay forward Leon Gutsmore. To make matters worse though, Harper then had a nightmare from the resulting free kick when he totally missed the ball in attempting to clear Gary Waters' downwards header, leaving Gutsmore with a great chance to increase the lead, but he somehow managed to lift the ball over the bar from only 6 yards. Looking at that incident, it was probably quite amusing that both Harper and Gutsmore ended up being prematurely substituted later on in the half, although it was actually because of injuries in both cases. But Aldershot's introduction of Ian Hathaway did see a change to a 4-4-2 formation, and that made them tighter defensively, with Billericay's only other chance of the half coming in the 2nd minute of injury time, when David Adacola got through just inside the area, but Gary Phillips made a brilliant one-handed save to tip the shot away. George Borg obviously wasn't happy with his side's first half performance though, especially as they hadn't managed to create a single clear-cut chance so far, so Roy Young was therefore brought on to replace midfielder Jimmy Dack for the start of the second half, albeit in what appeared to be a right-sided midfield position. But that gradually started to make a difference, with a number of half chances being created, before defender Jason Chewins came up to score a rare goal in the 76th minute with a confident finish, after Ian Hathaway had caused Billericay defender Chris Moore to panic with his attempted clearance. Billericay had obviously been sitting back on their lead before that equaliser though, and they soon came out of their shell again, with David Adacola going close on a couple of occasions, which included this effort in the 83rd minute. In fact, with the score at 1-1, both sides going for a winner and the crowd of 1,409 creating a good atmosphere, it promised to be an exciting last few minutes, but still there seemed to be a fair number of spectators who weren't happy with something. Indeed, they were to miss a contentious incident in the 88th minute, and so did referee Andy Legg, according to George Borg and the majority of Aldershot's players and supporters, as Billericay defender Chris Moore clearly put his arm up in the area from Ian Hathaway's cross to divert the ball away from the head of the on-rushing Joe Narty. In fact, Mr Legg did have a good view of the incident, but then so did Aldershot's most vociferous supporters behind that goal, and they were convinced they should have had a penalty, along with George Borg of course, judging from the booking he ended up with. Billericay were lucky to survive there then, and they had another escape in the 90th minute when Aldershot substitute Roy Young did superbly to shrug off defender Craig Davidson to get over a dangerous cross with the outside of the foot, but keeper Dave Root just managed to tip it away with Gary Abbott waiting to pounce. A 1-1 draw was how it finished though, which was a fair result, as Billericay had been the better side in the first half, with the shots on top in the second half, as the early introduction of Ian Hathaway eventually played dividends. Unfortunately though, Hathaway was unavailable for Aldershot's next match away to Bishop Stortford in the FA Cup second qualifying round, not because of any bizarre religious beliefs interfering with the Sunday afternoon kick-off, but because Colchester United didn't want him cup-tied. That meant there were call-ups for assistant manager Stuart Cash and former youth team player Nathan Tapley amongst the substitutes, while in the starting line-up the fit-again Jimmy Sagrew was preferred to Neil Champion, with Roy Young also coming in as Gary Abbott started a 3-match suspension for his controversial sending off at Bromley. As for the formation, manager George Borg decided on a 4-4-2 for this one, but with the versatile Colin Fielder in a midfield holding role this time, which meant Jimmy Dack had to play in a slightly wider role than usual, with Hathaway unavailable and Lee Endersby seemingly out of favour. Of course, with Aldershot having beaten Bishop Stortford 8-0 in their last meeting, with Stortford consequently slumping to the bottom of the Ryman League Premier Division table in shell shock since that result, no doubt some Shot supporters expected a similar scoreline from this match, but the sacking of manager Paul Taylor during the week leading up to this game put paid to that, as it resulted in general manager John Radford, the former Arsenal forward, taking charge of team affairs once again, as indeed he had with some degree of success in the past, and the first half an hour of this match showed that he he'd got his side sorted out defensively and well fired up, judging by Tony Comerford's challenge on Gary Phillips in the 29th minute, as although it was so late it was well off camera, we could clearly see what Comerford's intentions were, and it wasn't surprising that he ended up being shown a yellow card. However, Simon Stapleton's enforced departure a minute later seemed to be because of a self-inflicted injury rather than a dubious challenge by any Stortford player, but Lee Endersby's introduction didn't cause too much of a problem as he went into his normal left-sided role, with Jimmy Dack moving back to his usual central midfield position. With Bishop Stortford's players starting to put themselves about a bit though, George Borg's biggest problem was in trying to calm down his own players in the face of such intimidation, particularly the fiery Jimmy Sagru, who ended up being booked himself in the 31st minute for a retaliatory foul on Stortford's competitive midfielder Scott Forbes. In stark contrast to Sagru though is Shot's defender Jason Chewins, whose placid temperament would never see him get involved in such incidents, although after this late challenge on him by Tony Comerford in the 42nd minute, all he could do was lay on the floor waiting for physio Phil Shedden to attend to him anyway, while in the meantime Sagru was breaking away to waste a good chance by firing angrily over the bar from an acute angle, with Joe Narty and Roy Young both unmarked at the far post. If Sagru is Aldershot's most excitable player though, the gentleman in the glasses in the back row gets my vote for the Shot's most fired up supporter. Obviously he, along with George Borg of course, wanted Comerford sent off for a second bookable offence after that challenge on Jason Chewins, and they certainly had a fair point, but referee Trow did make the correct decision just a minute later when he booked Stortford's Scott Forbes for leaving his foot in on Colin Fielder. Perhaps not surprisingly, the first half finished scoreless because of Stortford's tactics, and with 6 changes having been made to their starting lineup by John Radford, plus a change to a more defensive formation, this was never likely to be a game full of goalmouth incident, and indeed neither goalkeeper had had a serious save to make so far. However, it was Bishop Stortford who managed to create the first clear-cut chance of the match just a minute after the break, when a glancing header from defender Peter Clifford from a Scott Forbes free kick skimmed the top of the crossbar with Gary Phillips beaten. In fact, Stortford came even closer to breaking the deadlock 3 minutes later when a superbly struck effort from Ernie Cooksey crashed off the crossbar with a lot more force this time, with Phillips presumably getting a touch to it as there were no complaints when a corner was given. All this was starting to become a real embarrassment for Aldershot, particularly in view of the scoreline when the two sides last met, and Lee Endersby didn't help matters when he became the 4th player in referee Trow's notebook in the 57th minute for a needless trip on Stortford's Jerry Ikazobo. It therefore needed a lucky break for the Shots to take a rather undeserved lead in the 61st minute, when Jimmy Sagru's rather average-looking effort from just inside the area was deflected onto the back of keeper Gavin King's leg by defender Peter Clifford and into the net for what has to go down as an own goal. That goal didn't exactly lead to a glut of goalmouth action though, as the next 20 minutes were disrupted by a spate of substitutions and yet more bookings by referee Trow, who maybe thought about adding Stortford's Paul Campbell to his list of victims in the 81st minute when he bundled into the back of Jimmy Sagru in the area to give away a rather obvious penalty. However, there were no complaints from Aldershot when Colin Fielder emphatically made it 2-0 from the spot anyway, as it virtually guaranteed them the victory and they could now look forward to the next round. That was especially so when Bishop Stortford really started losing their discipline shortly afterwards, with Will Cooper quite rightly getting sent off for trying out his John Hartson impersonation on Mark Harper's head, although Harper himself was lucky not to get booked for barging Cooper into the advertising hoardings in the first place. Then again, maybe Harper was booked, but such was the inadequate vantage point at Boreham Wood's ground that we had no hope of getting a clear view. Of course, the fact that Bishop Stortford had to ground share because of a delay in building their own new stadium was obviously a hindrance to them both financially and in terms of a lack of their own supporters willing to travel, especially when they are occasionally being forced to play on a Sunday. But such hardship was no excuse for their rather brutal tactics in this match, and forward Steve Conroy could also have been sent off in the 88th minute for what looked to be a quite deliberate elbow to the back of Jimmy Dack's head, leaving Dack requiring quite lengthy treatment from Phil Shedden. However, Conroy escaped with just a booking, but his colleague Tony Comerford had no such luck as play was about to resume from that incident, as he decided to drop his shorts in a show of dissent while lining up in Stortford's defensive wall, although whether it was aimed at referee Trow or the Aldershot supporters behind that goal is something that we can't quite tell, as he wasn't in the picture at the time. However, a linesman did see the incident, and after conferring with Mr Trow, it resulted in Comerford being sent on his way for a second bookable offence, leaving Stortford down to 9 men for the last few minutes. Although the match had by now drifted into injury time, George Borg still decided to bring on Kieran Philpott for his debut in place of Jimmy Dack, who may well have been suffering from some sort of concussion after Steve Conroy's challenge on him a few minutes earlier, and Philpott looked to be in with a good chance to increase Aldershot's lead in the 3rd minute of injury time as he burst into the area from Leandersby's pass, and if Scott Forbes did catch him, then Stortford would surely have been reduced to 8 men, with Forbes having already been booked, so either referee Trow had run out of room in his notebook, or Philpott had dived, but we can't really tell from this angle. Aldershot's victory in this match was never really in doubt once they took the lead though, with the main difference between the two sides being George Borg's ability to fire up his players sufficiently enough to win a close match, but without showing the total lack of discipline that marred John Radford's attempts to galvanise his Bishop Stortford side into the same sort of mentality. Although Jimmy Sagrew seemed to be doing his best to dispel that theory just after the final whistle, until Borg persuaded him otherwise in rather unorthodox fashion. Meanwhile, back in the Ryman League Premier Division, Aldershot had now gone 4 matches without a win, so they badly needed a return to form when they travelled to Carshalton Athletic the following Saturday. To try and help matters, George Borg therefore brought in 3 players of vast experience for this match, with his assistant Stuart Cash coming in for the injured Jason Chewins, Ian Hathaway replacing Jimmy Dack, and 34-year-old midfielder Paul Wilson being brought in on loan from Barnet at the expense of skipper Mark Harper, who now appeared to be out of favour with Borg. In fact, Terry Howard was now being given the captain's armband, while Colin Fielder joined him in defence for this game in a straightforward 4-4-2 formation. Although Carshalton were in a perilous position just 2 places off the bottom of the table, they had actually won their last 2 matches without conceding a goal, no doubt because of a recent financial boost they'd received from a long-awaited takeover of the club, which had enabled manager Ian Dawes to make some new signings. In fact, this newfound confidence looked apparent straight away, with midfielder Viv Jeffrey finding himself in an excellent position after cutting inside Stuart Cash's apology for a challenge after just 2 minutes. But thankfully Jeffrey didn't look confident about using his left foot to shoot, and the chance was subsequently wasted. However, Aldershot looked dodgy at the back again in only the 4th minute when Carshalton forward Junior Haynes avoided a couple of rather crude attempted fouls from Stuart Cash and Colin Fielder to set up Viv Jeffrey for another chance, but obviously he couldn't shoot with his right foot either. It was quite alarming to see Jeffrey get so much space though, particularly when he was involved in yet another good chance just a minute later, but it was certainly a clever tactical ploy by Carshalton, as they were playing with a formation which looked like a 4-4-2, but right back Neil Robson was pushing up into a right-sided midfield position, thereby forcing Ian Hathaway to mark him instead of Jeffrey, who was starting off in that position but kept drifting into a more central area just behind the front 2, which therefore pulled Stuart Cash out of position, leaving a big gap on the left-hand side of the Shot's defence. Thankfully, Aldershot managed to escape on that occasion, and despite a couple of other scares in the first 10 minutes, it was the Shots who actually managed the first on-target effort of the match, when Jimmy Sagrew forced Carshalton keeper Stuart Searle into a good save after 13 minutes. However, the Shots assistant manager Stuart Cash was having a bit of a torrid time up the other end, as Carshalton seemed to be testing him out as if he was some sort of weak link, and he certainly had trouble in dealing with Sean Daly's deep cross in the 15th minute, as John Fowler easily beat him in the air but saw his header bounce just wide, with Gary Phillips struggling. However, it was Aldershot who were actually getting in shots on target, and they managed to force keeper Searle into action again in the 19th minute, when Joe Narty outpaced defender Darren Pitcher in a run down the right, but the angle was probably a bit too acute in the end. Carshalton, though, could well have taken the lead just seconds later when an in-swinging corner from Kevin Smith rebounded off the face of the crossbar, with Gary Phillips completely caught out at his near post, this being the closest either side had come to scoring so far. As the half wore on, though, Aldershot's defenders finally managed to get to grips with Carshalton's formation, and after creating the occasional half chance up the other end, the Shots managed to nick a goal just seconds before half-time, when recent loan signing Ian Hathaway cut inside from the right onto his more favoured left foot to drill a superbly placed shot into the bottom corner. That was undoubtedly an ideal time to break the deadlock, as George Borg could then get his players together straight away to sort them out into a more cohesive unit defensively in order to hang on to their lead in the second half. And indeed the first 20 minutes or so after the break was sensibly non-eventful in terms of goalmouth incidents, although a couple of substitutions from Carshalton and 2 bookings also helped disrupt the flow of the game, until Terry Howard suddenly let fly with a speculative shot in the 68th minute, which again ended up in the bottom corner to put the Shots 2-0 up. After that, Aldershot were always in control, and Jimmy Sagrew then had a reasonable effort in the 80th minute with a dipping shot which keeper Searle had to hold on to, with Roy Young and Joe Narty both ready to pounce on any rebound. Sagrew, though, was clearly still in his Mr. Angry mode from the Shots' last match against Bishop Stortford, as he'd already been involved in a number of heated verbal exchanges with various Carshalton players when he found himself being deliberately trampled on by Sean Daly in the 83rd minute, which was obviously an attempt to goad Sagrew into some sort of retaliation, although the sheer amount of players who dived in to break up the incident stopped that. However, Sagrew still ended up getting booked, even though he didn't really do anything, but it could well have been the disgraceful reactions of this Carshalton official behind the barrier that influenced referee Armstrong into thinking Sagrew was the main aggressor, especially as this apparent club official was manning the entrance to the players' tunnel and was supposed to be preventing trouble, not starting it, and he was clearly well out of order. At least Daly was booked as well, but Sagrew nearly got his own back in the 90th minute when he got in behind the Carshalton defence and was only denied from making it 3-0 by a good save from keeper Searle. However, it was Carshalton who had what turned out to be the last chance of the match in the first minute of injury time, but Gary Bowyer fired wide from a good position after Richard Newberry's cross had bounced off the back of substitute Jimmy Dack's head. In general, though, Aldershot had been by far the better side in the second half, particularly in the last 10 or 15 minutes when they really dominated possession, as Carshalton seemed to give up. But although this was an improved performance by the Shots, the fact that Carshalton lost 8-2 to fellow strugglers Harrow Borough in their next match showed that George Borg still had a bit more work to do to get his side really firing on all cylinders. It was quite likely that mid-table Hendon would provide Aldershot with a slightly sterner test the following Tuesday night though, especially as the Shots had lost their previous 2 home matches. 2 changes were therefore made to the starting line-up, with Jimmy Dack and Lee Endersby coming in for Stuart Cash, who dropped to the substitutes bench, and Jimmy Sagrew, who was left out altogether, although that was presumably because of an injury rather than George Borg being annoyed about a lack of discipline, as the totally left-footed Endersby was now on the transfer list and being played well out of position on the right of midfield in order to keep Ian Hathaway on the left. In fact, with Jason Chewins still out injured, it was also surprising to see Stuart Cash left out, as midfielder Jimmy Dack started the game in the left-back position, so obviously Cash wasn't 100% fit and would only be brought on if things started going drastically wrong. However, Aldershot certainly started well, and they were unlucky not to take the lead after just 5 minutes, when Simon Stapleton got in a good header from an Ian Hathaway cross, but Hendon keeper Gary McCann made an excellent save low down to his left to tip the ball away. In fact, it was Hathaway who posed Hendon some problems again in the 9th minute with another good cross from the left which found the head of Roy Young this time, but the ball drifted narrowly wide of the far post with keeper McCann struggling to reach it. It was a really good start to the match for Aldershot though, and they were unlucky again in the 12th minute when Hathaway actually got in a header himself from Simon Stapleton's cross. But McCann made another vital save to turn the ball onto the post from almost point-blank range before defender Steve Bateman cleared the rebound. Hendon, though, had only lost once in their last 10 League and Cup matches coming into this game, so they were no mugs, and they gave the shots a warning in the 20th minute when Paul Whitmarsh scrambled the ball in from Tony Kelly's clever flick, but he was ruled marginally offside in doing so. However, Aldershot hit back by creating their best chance of the match so far in the 25th minute, as Lee Endersby's superbly weighted through ball found Ian Hathaway making a perfectly timed run to beat the offside trap, only for Joe Narty to take the ball off him and fire straight at the legs of the on-rushing Gary McCann. And although it was a good save, it was a 2-against-1 situation and the shots really should have made more of the opportunity. Presumably, Hendon were now starting to get a bit frustrated that Aldershot were the better side, as forward Junior Lewis was lucky not to get sent off in the 28th minute after appearing to grab Colin Field around the neck and then sort of clawing him in the face with his fingers and in full view of the linesman as well. But despite referee John Moore eventually conferring with that particular so-called assistant, Lewis escaped with only a booking. Of course, the home crowd in the family stand near to the incident were incensed by that, and our candidate for the shot's most animated supporter was really fuming when Joe Narty was booked for something far less serious 3 minutes later. However, this was what he was complaining about, and the word biased certainly comes to mind. To their credit though, Aldershot's players shrugged off these problems and they had another good chance to take the lead in the 33rd minute when Simon Stapleton, who was having a much better game than normal, caught Hendon's Gary Fitzgerald in possession and burst through on his own, only to fire disappointingly wide when he had time to hit the target. That was to prove a costly miss though, as Hendon then went and took the lead 3 minutes later, very much against the run of play, as Paul Whitmarsh ran onto Mark Pye's through ball rather too easily to score with a low shot which looped in off the legs of the unlucky Gary Phillips. In fact, Hendon could well have increased their lead in the 38th minute when defender Steve Bateman was given too much room to hook the ball into the 6-yard box following a corner, and it was actually Terry Howard who got the touch ahead of Hendon's Junior Lewis, but Gary Phillips was in the right spot to prevent an embarrassing own goal. It was becoming a really frustrating match to watch for the Shot supporters though, as their side had played really well in their build-up play but just couldn't finish, and Lee Endersby epitomised that in the 41st minute with a typically skillful run at the Hendon defence, only to aim his cross at a steward 20 yards behind the goal with Joe Narty unmarked in the 6-yard box. Obviously it was play like that which had prompted George Borg to put Endersby on the transfer list, as despite his obvious ability he was just too erratic for Borg's liking when he was demanding consistency from his players this season, and in fact it was forward Roy Young who showed Endersby how to cross the ball early and accurately, as Aldershot created the first chance of the second half in the 58th minute, but Joe Narty headed it wide at the far post with keeper McCann in no man's land. To make matters worse, Aldershot were then punished again after missing such a chance, as they conceded a nightmare second goal just 2 minutes later when the on-loan Paul Wilson passed the ball straight to Hendon's Tony Kelly, who then gave Paul Whitmarsh the chance to exploit Terry Howard's naivety in trying to play Junior Lewis offside when his left-back in this match, Jimmy Dack, was a midfield player and didn't know when to push up, meaning the result of it all was a rather inevitable but certainly spectacular finish. However, the sheer number of chances they created in this match so far meant that it was quite feasible that the Shots could still pull back a 2-goal deficit, and they nearly made a start in the 65th minute when Lee Endersby, who'd now swapped winged with Ian Hathaway, actually got over a decent early cross which found Roy Young running in unmarked, but he steered his shot wide from just 6 yards. It was all going wrong for the shots now though, as Colin Fielder ended up in referee Moore's notebook 2 minutes later for what may well have been a deliberate foul on Junior Lewis in retaliation for that incident in the first half. And the fact that Lewis had scored Hendon's second goal after escaping that sending off only made matters worse. Hendon, in fact, then could have made it 3-0 when the resulting free kick eventually ended up at the feet of Freddie Hyatt on the edge of the area, but he fired high and wide with Gary Phillips a bit off his line. With time starting to run out for Aldershot, George Borg decided to take a real gamble in the 69th minute by taking off Lee Endersby and putting defender Terry Howard up front in a 4-3-3 formation, with Mark Harper coming on to play at the back. But that didn't work sufficiently enough in the 75th minute, as Junior Lewis easily got past Harper and Colin Fielder to set up Paul Whitmarsh for a chance which he really should have buried. In fact, because Borg gets so animated on the touchline, there's no doubt a suspicion amongst some managers in non-league football that he's some sort of raving lunatic who just relies on motivation to get success, and they think that they can outdo him tactically. And Hendon manager Frank Murphy may well be one of them, judging by the clever tactics he employed in this match, which really started coming to fruition after Borg switched to a 4-3-3, as Murphy's 4-4-2 system had central midfielders Gary Fitzgerald and Mark Pye as his supposed wide men, so they kept tucking inside, while forwards Whitmarsh and Lewis kept either going wide into the channels or coming deep for the ball, and therefore pulling the Shot's defence all over the place. And that resulted in 3 clear-cut chances for Hendon in the space of 30 seconds in the 83rd minute, the first of which was stopped by a vital challenge from Mark Harper, and the next 2 being saved by Gary Phillips, both of them from Gary Fitzgerald, who in his time as one of Borg's former players from his previous club Enfield hardly ever crossed the halfway line. In fact, Aldershot got into even more of a mess trying to defend the resulting succession of corners, as from one of them Tony Kelly was left with a free header by Mark Harper, who was far too late in tracking his run, and the Shots were lucky to see the ball go wide. However, Aldershot's immediate introduction of Neil Champion for Simon Stapleton after that miss didn't make the slightest bit of difference, as the excellent Paul Whitmarsh dropped off to find acres of room in midfield again just a minute later, and when he played Junior Lewis in on goal with a perfectly timed through ball, it needed Gary Phillips to come to the rescue again to stop Hendon's now inevitable victory becoming even more emphatic. In the end then, Aldershot badly ran out of ideas from an attacking viewpoint themselves, and they were lucky to escape with just a 2-0 defeat, as Hendon had dominated for most of the second half, with Whitmarsh and Lewis confirming their reputation as one of the better striking partnerships in the division. Although if the Shots had taken some of the chances they had in the first half and built up a lead, it may well have been a different story. However, that was now 3 home defeats out of 3 since George Borg decided to have the Shots matches videoed on a regular basis, and the word jinx was starting to be uttered with a lot more frequency. Presumably it was safe to get the camera out at Grays Athletic the following Saturday then, as this was an away game in the FA Cup, not the league, and against a team from a lower division. However, George Borg again had to make a couple of enforced changes to the Aldershot lineup, as Paul Wilson and Ian Hathaway were both cup-tied as part of their loan deals, so Jason Chewins and Neil Champion came in to replace them, with Chewins' return at left-back allowing Jimmy Dack to play in his more familiar midfield role. However, Gary Abbott was still missing, but through injury this time after having completed his 3-match suspension, so Roy Young and Joe Narty continued up front. With Ryman League Division 1 side Grays having only lost once in their last 12 matches, it was important that Aldershot should try and get the upper hand from the start of this game, and having got permission from Grays' long-serving tea lady Beryl to use her back garden to film the match from, we consequently got a good view of the Shots taking a rather fortunate 5th minute lead, as we could clearly see it was Grays' number 9 Vinnie John heading Neil Champion's long throw into his own net, and nothing to do with Terry Howard, who was subsequently awarded the goal by Aldershot secretary and statistician Graham Brookland, who was no doubt sitting in the stand opposite to the camera and was conned by Howard taking the congratulations as he ran back to his position for the restart. However, Aldershot found it hard to build on that lead, mainly because the game was disrupted for the next 20 minutes or so by a number of petty bookings, and Lee Endersby was lucky not to be added to the total in the 26th minute for a rather blatant dive in the Greys penalty area, which was no doubt as a result of finding himself in a position to shoot with his right foot following his brilliant approach play and nutmegging defender Jason Walker. Another reason for the scrappy opening to this game though was the blustery gale-force wind whipping around the ground, and that had Grays keeper Ian Brooks in trouble in the 32nd minute when he misjudged a cross from Neil Champion and was relieved to see the ball just miss the far post. With the wind blowing from corner to corner but from right to left as we look at the pitch, Grays really had no chance of testing Gary Phillips in the first half, and this superbly struck effort from Vinnie John in the 37th minute ended up dying completely and giving Phillips balloon catching practice, with that same gust of wind travelling downfield at lightning speed to give the camera a real buffeting and make this video suddenly resemble the previous season's Aldershot compilation. The difficult conditions therefore ensured that the Shots held on to their 1-0 lead going into the second half, but if they expected an immediate onslaught from Grays because of the wind, it surprisingly didn't happen, and it wasn't until the 64th minute that Grays created a clear-cut chance, as wing-back Jason Walker made a good blindside run onto Jamie Wallace's through ball to get in a shot, which Gary Phillips saved with his legs before Danny Hazelden panicked with the rebound. Although Aldershot hadn't really looked in any trouble before that chance, George Borg still decided to make an immediate double substitution before play resumed, with Jimmy Segru and Mark Harper coming on to enable a switch to more or less a 5-4-1 formation, so it seemed that Borg's tactics were now to defend in numbers against the wind and try and hold on for a 1-0 victory. However, that was to prove a very risky decision, and it wasn't long before Grays conjured up another clear-cut chance when Danny Hazelden floated over a useful cross for the unmarked Vinnie John, but luckily for the Shots, his header was nowhere near as decisive as the one he put into the same net in the first half. However, it wasn't until the last 10 minutes that Grays really got on top, and the hapless Vinnie John had another chance in the 80th minute when he suddenly found himself clean through as a result of defender Steve Dickinson's tackle on Jimmy Segru, but the ball seemed to hold up in the wind and get stuck under his feet, giving Jason Chewins the chance to get back and put him off his shot, with referee A. Con wrongly giving a corner in the end. Nothing came of that though, but the 84th minute saw Grays have their best chance so far of grabbing an equaliser when they conjured up an excellent move from a throw-in, which saw Vinnie John lay the ball off perfectly for Ricky Hazel, but he somehow sent his first time effort over the bar from just 3 yards out. Grays weren't finished yet though, and they certainly had Gary Phillips in a spot of bother in the 86th minute as a looping cross from Jamie Wallace slowed down in the wind, forcing Phillips to make an improvised block with his legs to stop the ball going in, and he was lucky that the rebound fell to Terry Howard and not a Grays forward. As it turned out, Aldershot had just the one more hurdle to negotiate before they could claim their place in the next round, as they weathered the storm of a scramble in the area in the 88th minute, which finally ended with Jason Walker volleying into the side netting when he should have hit the target, and with Grays somehow finding a 95% increase in support for this match compared to a normal league game, the Shots did well to hold out in the end. However, they certainly rode their luck at times, and it appeared that they might have underestimated the strength of their opponents, despite Grays' impressive current form going into this match. But then it wasn't the ideal conditions for a game of football, and just getting through was the most important thing. That was especially so when a money-spinning home tie against near neighbours Woking turned out to be the reward, and thanks to a couple of postponements due to waterlogged pitches, this ended up being the Shots' next fixture. Fortunately, George Borg was able to have a stronger squad to choose from for this match, as Gary Abbott had now recovered from injury, while Ian Hathaway had now been signed on a permanent basis, which had allowed Borg to sell Lee Endersby to Slough Town. So Abbott and Hathaway were both named in the starting lineup, but both Joe Narty and Roy Young were left out, as Borg decided to field a 4-5-1 formation and leave Abbott on his own up front. Not surprisingly, there was a fair bit of media interest in this match, and it was definitely the tie of the round, with the crowd of 6,870 breaking a number of records. However, that meant the game had to be filmed from the back of the director's box after spectators in the family stand started complaining about the camera's usual vantage point being in their way, albeit 2 minutes before the game was due to start, and with various television companies already using up the room in the crane above the main stand, a mad dash round the perimeter of the pitch had to be made in order to get these pictures. Thankfully, no action was missed though, while the excellent state of the playing surface also added to the occasion, as this game could easily have been called off because of a torrential downpour all morning, and although there was some surface water in places, the ball was running fairly true, with Darren Hayes' shot for Woking after just 3 minutes causing a problem for Gary Phillips, more because of its direction rather than it slowing down in a puddle. Apart from that effort, George Borg's very defensive formation seemed to be working for the most part, although it wouldn't have been as effective if Colin Fielder had ended up getting sent off against his old club for this tackle from behind on Darren Hay after just 11 minutes, and he was lucky that it wasn't a World Cup referee in charge. Fielder did end up with a booking for that though, and that made him calm down a bit, but Gary Abbott was also in a determined mood, and he had a chance to break the deadlock in the 15th minute when he got in a deflected shot at the near post from Ian Hathaway's cross, but Woking keeper Lawrence Batty was alert enough to punch the ball away in rather unorthodox fashion. The only other chance of a predictably tight and scoreless first half didn't come until the 29th minute, but it went to Aldershot again as Simon Stapleton produced a well-struck effort from the edge of the area which had keeper Batty beaten but was just off target. Obviously, George Borg was happy with the way things were going, as no changes were made at half-time, and indeed Aldershot started the second half quite well by creating a good move 2 minutes after the break, as Jimmy Dack went on a positive run before playing a 1-2 with Gary Abbott, but the eventual shot ended up in the side netting. What must have pleased Borg the most though was his side's vastly improved defending in this match, as although Woking weren't in the best of form, lying just 4 points off the bottom of the table in the conference, they were still a better side than most of the teams that the Shots had played so far this season, and Terry Howard in particular was playing better than average, especially when he got back to head away a dangerous cross from Steve French in the 53rd minute, with forward Steve West waiting to pounce. However, Aldershot's formation meant that quick breaks from midfield looked to be their best option of scoring in this match, and Jimmy Sagru had Woking in trouble in the 55th minute when he forced keeper Batty off his line and perilously close to being sent off, according to some of Aldershot's more vociferous supporters. In fact, the replay shows that Batty may well have handled fractionally outside his area, and it certainly stopped Sagru from getting in a dangerous cross at least. But referee Bill Jordan gave Batty the benefit of the doubt, and the Shots had to look for another alternative of gaining an advantage. Of course, with Gary Abbott not having played for 6 weeks, it was asking a bit too much of him to score against a defensively well-organised conference side when he was playing on his own up front in such strength-sapping conditions. So Joe Narty was brought on to partner him in the 59th minute, as George Borg decided to make more of an effort to go for a winner. However, Woking then made a double substitution shortly afterwards to counteract that, and that resulted in a non-eventful spell of play until Aldershot had the best chance of the match so far in the 80th minute, as Ian Hathaway's jinking run set up Simon Stapleton on the edge of the area for a similar effort to the one he'd had in the first half, but again it was spectacular but fractionally off target. Woking hit back though as the game suddenly opened up a bit, and 2 minutes later Darren Hay forced Gary Phillips into what turned out to be the only real save made by either keeper in the match. In fact, the lack of goalmouth action in this game was really summed up in the 85th minute when Aldershot gained the free kick in a promising position, but Colin Fielder disappointingly failed to deliver, that of course provoking the home crowd into a loud groan. However, perhaps it was just as well that the game eventually and perhaps not surprisingly finished scoreless, as we would have had no chance of seeing any celebrations once the final whistle went, and really a permanent television gantry on top of the stand roof was now a necessity if the club wanted to progress back into the Football League and stage more games of this nature. At least the atmosphere of that match was highly exciting and memorable for those in the ground who did have a good view, and the replay the following Tuesday night was therefore awaited with much anticipation. However, Aldershot were without skipper Terry Howard, who'd picked up an injury in the first match, so Mark Harper returned to replace him, both as defender and captain. But that was the only change to George Borg's starting lineup, while the same 4-5-1 formation was fielded again, but with the left-footed Ian Hathaway starting the match wide on the right, and the right-footed Jimmy Sagru on the left. That suggested that Borg had told them to cut inside a bit more to support Gary Abbott rather than getting in pointless crosses to him when he was being marked by three centre-halves, and indeed the shots started the match very positively because of that, and they'd already had 2 or 3 half chances before Sagru and Hathaway caught Woking out again in the 10th minute when they suddenly swapped wings, with Hathaway getting over a dangerous cross from the left, which keeper Lawrence Batty almost fumbled into his own net under pressure from Simon Stapleton. In fact, the pressure seemed to make Woking defender Michael Danzy panic a bit, as he should have been booked for chopping down Gary Abbott from behind just a minute later, but Premiership referee Graham Pole was presumably treating this as a bit of a Mickey Mouse match and didn't bother. Indeed, the attendance figure was some way down on the first match at just under 4,000, most of whom seemed to be Aldershot supporters who were crammed into a tiny stretch of terracing just below the camera. And they had another reason to grumble in the 16th minute, as Darren Hay looked a yard offside in running onto a Steve French through ball, but fortunately Gary Phillips came to the rescue anyway. However, it was Aldershot who had the first decent shot of the match when Jimmy Dack forced keeper Batty into a spectacular tip-over from close range after 20 minutes, courtesy of a clever set-up from the increasingly influential Ian Hathaway. In fact, the shots then went one step better by taking a deserved lead in the 26th minute with an excellent goal, as Jimmy Sagru made Woking's Rob Hollingdale look rather silly before chipping the ball through for Gary Abbott to produce a classy finish. After that, Aldershot really grew in confidence, and Simon Stapleton wasn't too far away from adding a second in the 28th minute with a well-struck effort from nearly 30 yards. It had been a really encouraging performance from the shots up until that point, but Woking were in good form since the arrival of manager Brian McDermott to the club, and with them only having lost once in their previous 9 matches, it was unlikely that they'd cave in under pressure, and indeed they almost equalised in the 31st minute when a downwards header from Steve West from a Stuart Girdler corner had to be cleared off the line by Jason Chewins, or in fact it may even have hit the foot of the post, but we can't tell from this angle. As the half wore on though, Aldershot appeared to sit back on their lead a bit too much, and it was Woking who had the only other real chance just a minute before the break, when Steve Perkins' header from a Scott Smith long ball forced Gary Phillips into a vital save at the feet of Steve West. However, Aldershot definitely deserved their 1-0 half-time lead after what was one of their better displays so far this season, and they made a promising start to the second half as well, with Jimmy Dack getting a looping header from an Ian Hathaway cross in the 49th minute, but keeper Batty presumably had it covered judging by his reaction. In fact, the shots were still in control right up until the 61st minute, but a substitution by Woking which saw them switch from a 5-3-2 to a 4-3-3 formation was to have quite an effect, although that had nothing to do with this effort from Stuart Girdler in the 63rd minute, as it was through Aldershot not closing him down quickly enough that he was able to worry Gary Phillips. However, substitute Grant Payne did do the damage 2 minutes later when he got in behind Jason Chewins to fire in a close-range shot, which Phillips could only parry into the path of Darren Hay, who made it 1-1 with quite a finish, and that unfortunately left the shots looking rather deflated. At least they were given some hope though when Woking's supposedly informed striker Steve West produced what must have been one of the worst shots ever seen at Kingfield in the 72nd minute. However, the one change that manager Brian McDermott had made to the Woking side from the first match, midfielder Scott Steele, was beginning to be a major influence on the game, and he really tested Gary Phillips in the 74th minute with a swerving free kick that was heading for the top corner until it was tipped away. Just before that chance, George Borg had decided to go to a 4-4-2 formation again as he had in the first match by bringing on Joe Narty for a very irate looking Jimmy Sagru, but it didn't make any difference and the shots were still being forced to defend, albeit quite well though, but they certainly rode their luck in the 89th minute when somebody from this group of three virtually unmarked Woking players got their head to the ball on the edge of the 6-yard box from Scott Steele's free kick, but saw it bounce down and over the bar with Gary Phillips left rather exposed. That saw the teams finish level after 90 minutes and therefore have to endure extra time, in which Woking continued to look the stronger and fitter side, and they missed another good chance 5 minutes into extra time when Michael Danzy was allowed to win a header from a Stuart Girdler corner rather too easily, but fortunately for Aldershot he mistimed it wide of the far post. However, the 101st minute of the match saw Woking score what was a gradually inevitable second goal as Scott Steele confirmed that he had long since taken over Ian Hathaway's mantle as the most influential player on the pitch when he curled an excellent shot past Gary Phillips from the edge of the area to give Woking the lead. It now looked as if Aldershot might really start to crumble as they looked a bit shattered, both physically and mentally, but they suddenly managed their first shot at goal for over an hour when Simon Stapleton tried his luck from long range again 3 minutes later, but keeper Lawrence Batty was always right behind it. In fact, Woking had a better effort just seconds later when Darren Hay battled his way past some tired challenges in the area to cross for Scott Steele to get in another shot which Gary Phillips managed to stop fairly easily this time. That turned out to be the last piece of action in the first period of extra time, but Aldershot's introduction of Roy Young for midfielder Jimmy Dack and a switch to a 4-3-3 formation at the start of the second period did give them a fresh impetus, and they could well have equalised just 50 seconds after the restart when Joe Narty did well to work himself into a shooting position and curl the ball narrowly wide, but look at the unmarked Gary Abbott just to his right, as his reactions clearly show that Narty eventually chose the wrong option. Of course, once again, keeper Batty wasn't forced into a save, but Gary Phillips had certainly been kept busy up the other end, and that was one of the major differences between the two sides, with Grant Payne testing him yet again just seconds later. Meanwhile, referee Graham Pole had been gradually accumulating his average number of bookings per match, after initially appearing to think that this would be like a friendly compared to the likes of Arsenal versus Chelsea, and when Woking's Scott Smith rather unwisely chopped down Roy Young right under the noses of Messrs Borg, Cash and Shedden in front of the away team dugout, Mr Pole duly whipped out the yellow card again for what was the 8th and last time in the match. Challenges like that and some time-wasting tactics from Woking nevertheless saw them through in the end, as the shots rarely looked like getting back into the game, but overall Aldershot could hold their heads up high after their performances in both the first match and this replay, as it was a big improvement on some of their more recent league games, and the travelling Shot supporters recognised their efforts with a lengthy ovation at the end. Perhaps the fact that Woking faced tougher opposition every week in the conference helped them though, while some of Aldershot's players were either still trying to get used to the step up in class from Division 1 to the Premier in the Ryman League, or being too old to last the pace against this sort of opposition in a game going to extra time. There was also the possibility that the teamwork wasn't quite right yet though, as George Borg had made a lot of changes to his side from the previous season, and they were obviously still struggling to find some consistency. So a good win at home to Boreham Wood in their next match was certainly needed to get them back on the right track, especially after losing their last 3 league games at the Rec. Despite the probable tiredness from the 2 tough games against Woking, Borg made only one change to his starting lineup for this one though, with Roy Young being preferred to Jimmy Sagru, which therefore meant a return to a more attacking formation with Young partnering Gary Abbott up front and Ian Hathaway playing in a slightly more advanced role than the other 3 midfielders wide on the left. As was probably expected though, Aldershot's players did look a bit stiff early on, as Boreham Wood created 2 or 3 half chances in the first 10 minutes or so, including this rather freak incident when a challenge between their former Chelsea and England forward Kerry Dixon and Shots defender Jason Chewins saw the ball loop dangerously close to the empty net with Gary Phillips stranded. In fact, the Shots had to wait until the 21st minute for their first real shot at goal, when the informed Simon Stapleton made a positive run onto a Gary Abbott layoff to force Boreham Wood keeper Martin Taylor into a good save diving low to his left. However, Aldershot didn't really capitalise on that, and with Boreham Wood not having a very good season in the league, lying down in 14th place when they are normally a top 6 side, it was starting to look like another possible embarrassment for the Shots, especially in the 28th minute when a bad mistake from Ian Hathaway allowed Mark Brown to get in, but thankfully he produced a poor cross which gave Mark Harper the chance to nip in and clear the danger. Luckily for Aldershot though, the Boreham Wood defence made 2 mistakes in the 33rd minute which turned out to be costly, as their number 3 Alan McCarthy completely missed his attempted back pass, and then giant defender Gary Nisbet lunged into a rather laboured looking challenge which allowed Roy Young to run on and produce a very confident finish, considering he'd been left out of the starting lineup for most of the season so far. Nisbet though almost redeemed himself 2 minutes later when he went up for a corner and suddenly found himself in enough space to turn and force Gary Phillips into a smart save. But when Jason Chewins cleared the rebound downfield, Nisbet's defensive partner McCarthy made another howler which let in Roy Young again, and when keeper Taylor mistakenly tried to let the ball run into the area so that he could dive on it, it only resulted in a relatively simple second goal both for Young and the Shots, and it put them firmly in the driving seat. In fact, Young was unlucky not to complete a first-half hat-trick right on the half-time whistle after a sharp turn in the area from what was presumably a shot by Jason Chewins, but he'd done enough anyway to make it a very satisfactory first 45 minutes for the Shots. Of course, with the attendance only being 1,964 for this match, the atmosphere was somewhat muted in comparison to the 2 encounters against Woking, although teams like Boreham Wood would no doubt give their right arm for a crowd like that. But the reduction in decibels had probably contributed to Aldershot's players being a bit less enthusiastic than normal at the start of this match, and it was a good job that Roy Young's finishing had made all that irrelevant by half-time. Indeed, it was confirmed that the Shots had now got the big match atmosphere out of their system and were fully focused on the bread and butter of the league when they went 3-0 up just a minute after the break, as Ian Hathaway spotted Gary Abbott unmarked at the far post, Abbott converting with a close-range header which keeper Taylor couldn't quite keep out. That saw Boreham Wood manager Bob Makin making a double substitution almost immediately afterwards, in desperation really, but it didn't make any difference and the Shots could well have scored another in the 55th minute, but Ian Hathaway chipped the ball wide from a good position after being well set up by Neil Champion. However, Hathaway soon made amends for that in the 62nd minute when he sent over a perfect cross from the left for Gary Abbott to expertly chest the ball down and beat keeper Taylor from close range. That made it 4-0 and Aldershot should have been given a chance to make it 5 from the penalty spot just 2 minutes later, when Abbott was clearly pushed to the floor by defender Steve Daly as he tried to get on the end of Gary Smart's cross at the far post, but referee Jeff Pettit just awarded a corner. Of course, both Gary Abbott and Roy Young had now scored 2 goals apiece in this match, but it was the presumably psychic Aldershot PA announcer Tim Noyes who also had something to celebrate, as after Young's second goal in the first half he enthusiastically informed the crowd that Young was on his way to a hat-trick, something which was greeted with a mixture of laughter and derision by both sets of supporters at the time. But he was indeed right, as from that contentiously awarded corner given by Mr Pettit, it was Young who volleyed in the rebound to make it 5-0 after the unlucky Abbott had seen his header tipped onto the bar by keeper Taylor. It was now rapidly turning into one of the Shots' best performances of the season, especially from the way their 6th goal came about in the 82nd minute, because Boreham Wood deliberately marked Simon Stapleton tightly at the near post for substitute Jimmy Sugrew's corner because he'd got the flick on from that position which created the previous goal. So Roy Young went there as well this time, and with everyone marking Stapleton, Sugrew picked out Young instead for the flick on, which enabled Gary Abbott to complete his hat-trick with an easy downwards header at the far post. Perhaps Aldershot then got a bit too confident after profiting from such a clever move like that, as Boreham Wood suddenly had a rare chance a minute later, but Gary Phillips proved what good form he'd been in so far this season, as he'd hardly had anything to do all match, but was still alert enough to deny substitute Mark Xavier. However, the Shots did create a couple of half chances shortly after that, but 6-0 was how it finished after an excellent team performance, although they had to admit that Boreham Wood didn't really want to know in the second half, especially as their next match was at home to Luton in the FA Cup live on Sky, and clearly none of their players wanted to get injured with that one coming up. In fact, there were no bookings in the match at all, and Boreham Wood's normally thuggish central defenders Gary Nisbet and Steve Daly hardly committed a foul, which obviously helped Gary Abbott and Roy Young claim a hat-trick apiece, with Abbott somehow managing to claim the match ball off referee Pettit at the end, after Young's attempts to demand it seemed to be contemptuously swept aside. While Boreham Wood had a glamour tie to look forward to then, the Shots' next fixture was against the little-known Moneyfields from the Deuce and Wessex League in the Hampshire Senior Cup, with the result being quite predictable, but the amazingly large crowd of 979 and a further 4 goals for Roy Young were not what everyone expected, although it was good news for everyone connected with the club. However, the following Saturday's league game at mid-table Harrow Borough certainly didn't go to plan, as although Terry Howard and Jimmy Sagrew both returned to the starting line-up to supposedly strengthen the side from the Boreham Wood match, Aldershot just didn't perform as a team, and George Borg was furious afterwards about the lack of effort, especially as the 2 games against Woking had appeared to indicate that the Shots were well capable of winning the Premier Division and even holding their own in the conference. It was obvious that Aldershot would have to play better in their next match the following Tuesday night though, as visitors Aylesbury United were 5 points clear at the top of the table and had only lost once in their 15 league matches so far. That saw George Borg decide to field the same starting line-up and formation as he had in the game against Boreham Wood, with Mark Harper coming in for the injured Terry Howard and Neil Champion being preferred to Jimmy Sagrew, but obviously another 6-0 win against this sort of opposition was asking a bit too much. Unfortunately though, the first half of this match turned out to be a dreadful spectacle as the pitch was freezing up badly and players were having trouble keeping their feet, with the forwards of both sides consistently falling into the deliberate offside traps being played because they were unable to turn sharply and adjust their runs. Of course, the uncertain conditions underfoot also resulted in numerous fouls, most of which were slight little nudges or ankle taps caused by players losing their balance, and which referee Kevin Merchant could easily have let go. But he decided to penalise everything and completely disrupt the rhythm of the game, much to the disgust of both the crowd and the players of both sides. And indeed, the only shot from either side in the first 45 minutes came from one of those free kicks, when Aylesbury's Jason Solomon forced Gary Phillips into a sprawling save at the foot of the post. Although most of the players presumably changed their boots at half-time, the start of the second half carried on in much the same vein, and it wasn't until the 59th minute that either keeper was threatened again, with Gary Phillips having to make another smart save to keep out Gary Crawshaw's close-range diving header. Unfortunately though, referee Merchant was still interrupting the flow of the game with some petty decisions, mainly against Aldershot, and Jimmy Dack and Ian Hathaway both showed their frustration in the 63rd minute after Dack was penalised for putting an arm out to protect himself in an aerial challenge, especially as Aylesbury didn't appeal for a foul and would have been quite happy for the game to continue. At least Aldershot did manage to get near the Aylesbury goal without Mr Merchant hampering them just a minute later though, as Roy Young struck a fierce drive into the side netting for what was really the Shots' first decent effort of the match. In fact, Mr Merchant actually let an Aldershot player off the hook in the 70th minute, as he didn't even speak to Gary Smart after this late challenge on Jermaine Darlington, which looked like an obvious bookable offence, so perhaps he was now starting to be influenced by the fact that everybody had been moaning at him throughout the game so far. As for Smart though, he was hauled off by George Borg 4 minutes later, along with Jason Chewins and Roy Young, as a rather desperate looking triple substitution was made, with Stuart Cash, Jimmy Sagrew and Joe Narty all coming on, with almost half the team having to switch positions to accommodate them. However, several other Aldershot players weren't having a particularly happy time of it in this match either, and former Aylesbury player-manager Gary Phillips only succeeded in giving the noisy travelling supporters a good laugh in the 80th minute, when not for the first time in the match he lost his footing on the frozen surface, with his attempted clearance actually going backwards. Of course, that could easily have resulted in a goal, and the Shots rode their luck again in the 82nd minute when Aylesbury midfielder Steve Butler, who was wearing a squad number 16 in this match by the way, just to confuse everybody, got in a close range half volley from a Kieran Gallagher corner, which Colin Fielder somehow managed to block on the line before Jason Solomon eventually wasted the rebound. However, Solomon certainly didn't waste the chance he got just a minute later when he fired a spectacular shot from a 30-yard free kick almost straight through Gary Phillips, who obviously couldn't contend with the pace of the ball, and that was really no more than Aylesbury deserved on the balance of play. Indeed, they could easily have made it 2-0 in the 86th minute as manager Bob Dowie's tactics of using two players who are normally forwards in Jermaine Darlington and Kieran Gallagher as his wing-backs in a 3-5-2 formation really paid off in this match, with Darlington, who was Aylesbury's best player on the night, producing an excellent run and cross for an unmarked Gary Crawshaw to head wide from only 6 yards. In the end, Aldershot were lucky to survive with just a 1-goal defeat, and considering they had actually given 100% in this match in terms of effort, this result really confirmed just how much tougher this division was compared to Division 1, with all the top sides, of which Aldershot can be included, having strengthened their squads with quality players, many of whom had been squeezed out of the professional game by foreign signings and had therefore decided to play in the Ryman League in preference to the Conference, as they could then make more money working full-time in the London area, while not having to get time off to travel the length and breadth of the country in order to pick up their additional half-decent wage playing semi-professional football. Fortunately, Aldershot's next game was against a side who didn't quite have the financial resources necessary to attract players like that, but fellow Ryman League Premier Division side Bromley were an awkward side to play against, and the Shots could have been given an easier draw as they started their campaign in the FA Trophy. That was especially so when George Borg had a number of injuries to contend with, as Gary Phillips and Gary Smart joined Terry Howard on the sidelines, with on-loan goalkeeper Neil Finn and assistant manager Stuart Cash coming into the side, while Jimmy Segru was preferred to Simon Stapleton in a straightforward 4-4-2 formation, which was obviously intended to give more width to the side and a bit more service for Roy Young and Gary Abbott. Bromley, though, weren't in the best of form, having slipped down to 12th in the table after only one win in their last 11 league games, and you could probably see why when defender Keith Sharman bizarrely headed an Ian Hathaway free kick towards his own goal in only the 12th minute, while under no real pressure, and his teammate Dean Francis had to make an important clearance, although the ball looked to be going wide anyway. However, the Shots then got in an effort of their own making from the resulting corner, as the ball was presumably whipped in quickly by Ian Hathaway, which caught everyone out apart from Gary Abbott, who went narrowly wide with a good glancing header. With this match being refereed by Kevin Merchant again though, it was feared that moments of excitement like that might be few and far between, but apart from an early lecture for George Borg after the Aldershot boss had complained about one petty decision, Mr Merchant let the game flow a bit more this time, but it was Bromley who had the next chance in the 20th minute when their Ivory Coast-born Frenchman Lardry Zanaoni ran onto a long ball from Dean Francis, but the Shots' young keeper Neil Finn came off his line well to get a hand to the shot, allowing Jason Chewins to clear. However, Mr Merchant did annoy Aldershot in the 32nd minute when he awarded Bromley a free kick for a non-existent foul by Jimmy Segru near the halfway line, and that gave Bromley the chance to make the most of their usual way of scoring from a set piece with a big defender coming up to head in from 6 yards, namely Keith Sharman on this occasion, although most teams wouldn't give him quite so much room in which to do so. It was gradually turning out to be another disjointed performance from Aldershot though, and they should have been going in at half-time 2-0 down, when in injury time at the end of the half, Sharman had another headed goal controversially disallowed for what Mr Merchant decided was a foul on keeper Neil Finn. However, the slow-motion replay reveals that Finn actually punched Dean Wordsworth's corner into his own net and then clattered into Sharman by grabbing him round the neck, with Sharman not at fault at all. Not surprisingly then, the Bromley players surrounded referee Merchant when he blew the half-time whistle a minute later, with manager George Wakeling also coming on to give him a mouthful of abuse, as another goal to Bromley at that stage could well have killed the game off. Of course, that escape then allowed George Borg to motivate his troops sufficiently enough during the interval to make a much brighter start to the second half, and after a good spell of pressure they had a reasonable chance to equalise in the 50th minute when Jimmy Segru managed to get in a low cross to Gary Abbott at the near post, but Bromley's American keeper Anthony Latronica made a good block low down at his feet. With both sides in poor form though, it was Bromley who had slightly had the edge up until that point, probably because they were fielding a full-strength side, whereas Aldershot had a number of players missing through injury. But the introduction of Joe Narty for Jimmy Dack in the 59th minute and a change to more or less a 4-2-4 formation certainly helped the Shots, and they looked dangerous in the 64th minute when Gary Abbott took advantage of a mistake from Keith Sharman to get over an inviting low cross, but neither Narty or Roy Young were able to get on the end of it. However, it was in defence that Aldershot had problems with key players being unavailable, and they looked dodgy because of that in the 67th minute as Lardry Zanaoni threaded the ball through to an unmarked Danny Carroll just inside the area, but Neil Finn came quickly off his line to make a good save with his legs. In fact, with the Shots throwing everyone forward now, they started getting caught on the break a lot more often, and that almost resulted in an unfortunate own goal for Mark Harper in the 79th minute, as he made a desperate attempt to avert the danger, and Neil Finn eventually had to make another good save, this time from right underneath his own crossbar. Although Aldershot had been putting the Bromley defence under a lot of pressure, they hadn't really created many clear-cut chances at all, and they'd been rather running out of ideas until Gary Abbott suddenly managed to find some space on the edge of the 6-yard box to intelligently hook the ball across for substitute Joe Narty to equalise in the 81st minute with a close-range header. However, that only went and fired Bromley up again, and they came close to regaining the lead just 2 minutes later, when the useful Lardry Zanaoni crashed a powerful header against the Shots crossbar from a Dean Wordsworth free kick. Zanaoni, in fact, was eventually sold to Luton later on in the season, but Aldershot were no doubt wishing he'd been sold before this match when he supplied a pinpoint corner shortly afterwards, which allowed Wordsworth to get in a good header this time. The more the game went on, it seemed that Bromley were the more likely side to find a winner, especially when Roy Young limped off for the Shots in the 89th minute, but his replacement Simon Stapleton was to have quite an amazing impact on the game, as he managed to put his side 2-1 up with his first touch of the ball just 20 seconds after coming on, although it has to be said that Bromley keeper Anthony Latronica didn't look too convincing, and in fact he looked a bit of a wally as he stood there motionless as Aldershot's players celebrated. However, there was certainly nothing wrong when Aldershot wrapped the game up with a dramatic third goal on the break in the first minute of injury time, when Gary Abbott, of all people, hoofed the ball downfield from a scramble in defence for Joe Narty to cleverly beat defender Ian Rawlings on the halfway line and then run on to beat keeper Latronica with a really cool finish. With the final whistle going just seconds later, it was a great way for the Shots to finish the match, although Joe Narty's prayers at the end were no doubt being uttered along the lines of "Thank you God for sparing me from the wrath of George Borg," and really all his teammates probably should have joined him, as it was a bit of a lucky scrape through to the next round. Borg wasn't fooled by the scoreline though, and he realised that some new faces had to be brought in urgently, and making his debut in the League Cup tie at Division 1 side Chertsey the following Tuesday night was former Republic of Ireland under-21 international defender Owen Cole, who'd been signed from Stevenage Borough. However, this game wasn't captured on film, as some of the minor cup competitions were quite rightly not very high up on George Borg's list of priorities at the time, and unfortunately that meant a bit of a thriller was missed. But winning the league was the most important thing, and the Shots were now starting to get left behind a bit, so it was vital to get a good result the following Saturday when they travelled to face George Borg's previous side, Enfield. The Aldershot starting line-up for this one, though, clearly indicated that Borg had been getting fed up with his defenders making too many mistakes in recent matches, as 19-year-old Lee Holsgrove was brought in on loan from Wycombe Wanderers to join Owen Cole, who'd only made his debut in the previous match, while Terry Howard also returned, with Mark Harper surprisingly having been released during the week. However, playing all three together at the back as a completely untried unit while changing to a 3-5-2 formation was surely a massive gamble, and with Ian Hathaway also playing in an unfamiliar role, it certainly appeared that Borg was trying to outdo his good friend Gary Calder, the Enfield manager, in a tactical battle, as they were playing a very similar system themselves. Despite lying 5 points behind Aldershot in the table though, Enfield had an advantage in that they were fielding a settled and informed side with only one defeat in their last 6 League and Cup matches, and that was only a narrow 2-1 reverse at Nationwide Division 2 side York City in an FA Cup replay. So maybe it wasn't too much of a surprise when they took the lead after only 14 minutes, when midfielder Mark Bentley bundled in a low cross from Sammy Cooper for a very soft looking goal. At least Aldershot didn't have any major problems from an attacking point of view, as although Roy Young was out injured, Joe Narty was a useful enough replacement, especially after his 2 late goals in the last match, and he was unlucky not to equalise in the 23rd minute, and so was Gary Abbott, after the Enfield defence had failed to deal with Neil Champion's long throw, but keeper Andy Pape made an excellent double save to deny both of them. Unfortunately though, Aldershot had no luck again just 2 minutes later, when referee Ralph Bone awarded Enfield a penalty for what appeared to be a perfectly fair challenge by Lee Holsgrove on Russell Penn, and not surprisingly the majority of Aldershot's players were rather incensed by that decision. Of course, Richard Dunwell then made it 2-0 with a spot kick which gave Gary Phillips little chance, and the Shots had a real uphill struggle now. That was especially so because of the badly churned up pitch, which had been caused by a rugby club being invited to share the facilities in order to ease Enfield's severe financial problems, and no doubt that had affected both sides in the first half, as it finished with only 3 real chances having been created in total, with Enfield taking both of theirs, although the penalty was of course highly contentious, and Shot skipper Terry Howard was still complaining about it as the teams walked off. Although Aldershot had been a bit unlucky to find themselves behind, George Borg decided to make a double substitution for the start of the second half by bringing on midfielders Jimmy Segru and Simon Stapleton for Lee Holsgrove and Colin Fielder in order to revert back to his more usual 4-4-2 formation, and they immediately looked more of a cohesive unit because of that. In fact, the Shots then managed to create a good chance to pull a goal back in the 60th minute when recently signed defender Owen Cole got forward to cross for Joe Narty, who outjumped keeper Andy Pape but then saw his looping header cleared off the line by Grant Cooper. However, Aldershot had a real escape just a minute later when Enfield hit them on the break as the impressive Mark Bentley charged down Owen Cole's attempted clearance and ran on to keep his composure by providing Richard Dunwell with a great chance right in front of goal, but he could only side-foot the ball straight at Gary Phillips. That almost immediately saw George Borg bring on the slightly more attacking Kieran Philpott for a rare run-out instead of Neil Champion, who'd been playing in a midfield holding role, but that only left the Shots even more exposed to Enfield's quick breaks, and when Enfield forced a corner in the 67th minute from one of them, it resulted in Gary Phillips having more work to do to keep out Steve Terry's far post header. However, Aldershot really got themselves in a mess at the back 2 minutes later when Owen Cole inadvertently produced a perfect headed flick-on from Lee Prothero's long ball straight into the path of John Richardson for a clean run on goal until he was upended by Terry Howard's desperate lunge from behind. That of course resulted in Howard being sent off for a professional foul once referee Bone decided that he hadn't made contact with the ball, a decision which most Aldershot players and supporters seemed to think was very harsh. However, unlike the incident in the first half when Mr Bone awarded Enfield a penalty for Lee Holsgrove's perfectly fair challenge, he was spot on this time, and the overheated protests of Howard and Gary Phillips in particular looked very false. Indeed, it was a desperate and futile attempt to get Mr Bone to change his mind, and as Howard slowly trudged off, Richardson picked himself up to score from the spot and put Enfield out of sight with a 3-0 scoreline. Things then started getting even worse for Aldershot after that, and they were lucky not to be reduced to 9 men, as Ian Hathaway lost his discipline in the 74th minute when he smacked Enfield's Sammy Cooper in the face with a flailing arm, causing 1 or 2 home supporters to get a bit irate behind the dugouts, with somebody having a go at George Borg, who had to be calmed down by Enfield manager Gary Calder. Of course, 99% of the Enfield supporters had given Borg a great reception at the start of the match because of the success he'd given them before joining Aldershot, so it must have been extremely embarrassing for him to be facing such a scoreline, which was made even more emphatic in the 78th minute, when Owen Cole, who actually lives in Enfield and no doubt had a few friends and relatives at the match, had a nightmare when he failed to clear Mark Bentley's short pass to Richard Dunwell in the area, leaving Dunwell with a relatively easy chance to score his second of the game and Enfield's fourth. It was turning into a really miserable second half for the Shot supporters, especially as they had to stay put behind the goal that the home side were now attacking because of a segregation policy adopted by Enfield for this match, based on the ridiculous rumours emanating from other clubs that the majority of the Shots fans were hooligans. But obviously if that was the case, they would no doubt have invaded the pitch to protest at this performance rather than sneaking out quietly 12 minutes before the end, or at least relatively quietly. However, most of them stayed till the final whistle, and they were lucky not to witness a fifth goal for Enfield in the 87th minute, when their teenage substitute Danny Alleyne burst clear of a badly square defence to beat the oncoming Gary Phillips, but his shot rebounded off the post conveniently enough for Gary Smart to step in and clear the danger. In the end then, Aldershot had actually escaped with only a 4-goal defeat, as it could have been even worse, and although the Shot's injury problems didn't help matters, some players had let their heads go down badly, and a confident Enfield side really took advantage. In fact, the travelling Aldershot supporters deserved a lot of credit, as they amazingly stayed and applauded their side at the final whistle, even though they had no real reason to, and George Borg was actually quite angry that his players were reluctant to respond to it like they would normally do. Perhaps those supporters felt that the Shots still had a chance of winning the league despite that result, but the current Premier Division table suggested otherwise, as Aldershot were now down in 10th place after what was their third successive league defeat, while a run of just 2 wins in 10 league matches meant they were now 18 points behind leaders Aylesbury, having been at the top of the table themselves at the start of that poor run of form, and although the Shots did have an excellent goal difference, they realistically couldn't afford many more slip-ups, even though there was a long way to go yet. Thankfully, Aldershot had another round of the Hampshire Senior Cup to play in before their next league match, so George Borg fielded his strongest available side in that, as it gave them the opportunity of some valuable practice in improving the teamwork without any real fear of losing, although Hampshire League minnows Loxheath did put up a better show than was probably expected, judging from the scoreline. The following Saturday then saw the Shots face Bromley in front of their lowest league gate of the season so far of 1,687, so clearly their poor form was starting to have a negative effect on some of their supporters. However, George Borg made only one change to his starting line-up from the Enfield match, with Jimmy Sagrew coming in for the suspended Jason Chewins, but there were quite a few alterations made to the formation, with Colin Fielder now at sweeper, Lee Holsgrove in a midfield holding role, Jimmy Sagrew in a more central midfield position, and Ian Hathaway as more or less a wing-back. So with Borg continuing with this 3-5-2 system, there presumably must have been a lot of work done on it in training in order to avoid the mistakes they made using it at Enfield. Of course, Aldershot had beaten Bromley in the FA Trophy at the Rec only a couple of weeks earlier, but they were a bit lucky to do so and were helped by some dodgy goalkeeping from Bromley's Anthony Latronica. However, there was no sign of him for this match, and unfortunately for the Shots, his replacement Maurice Nundan looked a lot more capable, judging from the excellent double save he made after only 3 minutes to deny Gary Abbott and then Joe Narty. Obviously it was a bad mistake from Bromley defender Keith Sharman which allowed Aldershot to get that chance, but they had another opportunity from a defender's miss-kick in the 10th minute when sweeper Dean Francis let the ball go straight through his legs to leave Gary Abbott in on goal again, but much to the annoyance of the well-placed Joe Narty, Abbott blasted his shot into the side netting. However, Aldershot disappointingly started losing their way a bit after that bright start to the game, with promising moves coming to nothing because of a poor final ball or irritating decisions being made by referee Martin Wyville, such as this one in the 25th minute when he gave Bromley a goal kick when it was a blatantly obvious corner. In fact, the home crowd got really annoyed 2 minutes later when Mr Wyville didn't even give the shots a free kick after defender Keith Sharman had clearly climbed all over Gary Abbott on the edge of, or maybe even inside the area. And it wasn't a surprise to see George Borg leaping out of his dugout complaining about that one. Bromley, though, had shown an improvement in form since their defeat to Aldershot in the FA Trophy, and they were starting to make it very difficult for the Shots to create anything until Ian Hathaway somehow managed to find space to get a crossover in the 39th minute, which Gary Abbott got on the end of, and he was unlucky to see his well-controlled half-volley drift just wide. However, Hathaway caused problems for Bromley again just seconds later when Jimmy Sagru set him up for another good chance, which Joe Narty headed just wide under pressure from defender Oliadi DG. One of Aldershot's best chances of what turned out to be a scoreless first half came in the first minute of injury time though, when Colin Fielder's shot on the turn flicked off the head of his teammate Owen Cole inside a crowded penalty area and just missed the far post with keeper Nundan stranded, and that was typical of the game so far really. In fact, it was looking as if Bromley would be quite happy with a goalless draw from this match up until that point, but they suddenly came out of their shell 4 minutes into the second half when an enticing ball into the danger area from Dean Wordsworth caught out Gary Phillips, who was slow off his line, and Colin Fielder had to come to the rescue with an excellent clearance to stop Lardri Zanaoni from profiting. However, that excursion into the Aldershot area proved to be a rarity, and indeed the Shots finally managed to take the lead themselves in the 56th minute in very basic fashion, as Owen Cole just stood on the goal line and out-jumped keeper Nundan to head in an Ian Hathaway corner. Although their side were now in front at last, perhaps some of Aldershot's more demanding supporters wanted to see something just a little bit more spectacular though, and they certainly saw some brilliance from Ian Hathaway in the 59th minute, but Gary Smart then spoilt everything by attempting a shot, or at least that's what we assume it was. Obviously, Bromley now had to have a change of plan if they wanted to get anything out of this game though, so forward Gary Moore was brought on for defender Ian Rawlings in the 61st minute, but Bromley was still reorganising from that when Aldershot had another chance just seconds later, as Gary Abbott superbly put Lee Holsgrove through, but he was forced into shooting narrowly over the bar by the presence of substitute Moore, who'd been brought on to score, not defend. In fact, it looked as if Bromley didn't really have much of a clue when it came to attacking to get back into a match after going behind, especially after a bizarre incident in the 65th minute when keeper Nundan was booked for persistently trying to take a free kick in the wrong place to where the original offence occurred, plus no doubt a spot of dissent as well of course. However, with Bromley losing, they needed him to get on with the game quickly and not time waste like this, so not surprisingly the Shot supporters were in hysterics when the yellow card was waved at him. When Bromley did attack though, they generally came up against a much more organised Aldershot defence in this match, while the Shots were now also looking effective on the break, with wing-back Gary Smart getting a lot further forward than he'd managed so far in his Aldershot career, and he managed to test keeper Nundan with a left-footed shot on this occasion in the 69th minute, after sensibly not trying to get the ball onto his right foot after that previous effort a few minutes earlier. In fact, Smart was then involved in another good move just a minute later, which eventually ended with Jimmy Sagru setting up Gary Abbott for a shot on the turn, which went narrowly wide with keeper Nundan beaten. However, Nundan was beaten again just a minute after that, but this time by his own player, as Aldershot suddenly found themselves 2-0 up when Keith Sharman headed an Ian Hathaway free kick into his own net so positively that if this was an FA Carling Premiership match he'd probably end up getting arrested, particularly as he'd come within inches of doing exactly the same thing in the FA Trophy match against the Shots a couple of weeks earlier. In fact, PA announcer Tim Noyes could also have been under suspicion when he wrongly read out Gary Abbott as the goal scorer, although when Bromley made a double substitution shortly afterwards which left them playing a suicidal formation with only two at the back, Abbott did manage to get in a legitimate shot in the 80th minute, albeit with the help of a deflection off Bromley's Frank Coles which sent keeper Nundan the wrong way, but once again Joe Narty was left looking annoyed and maybe Abbott chose the wrong option in the end. However, it was certainly a good determined run, and in general all the Shots players were showing a vast improvement in effort, attitude and teamwork in this match, and they deservedly went 3-0 up in the 83rd minute when Lee Holsgrove, who'd looked a much better player in his central midfield role in this match, burst through the middle to set up Gary Abbott for what was a rather scrambled finish, but they all count. Indeed, with that being the final score, it meant Abbott had now scored 17 goals in 20 appearances for the club since joining during the summer, and he was proving to be an inspired signing, along with Colin Fielder and Ian Hathaway in particular. And it was clear from this performance that if the rest of the side could show their consistency, then the Shots could still end up winning something at the end of the season. However, Bromley were a team on the slide, but the Shots' next opponents would be a tough nut to crack, as Dagenham and Redbridge were 4 points above the Shots in the table, in a good run of form and fielding a full-strength side. Aldershot, on the other hand, were without skipper Terry Howard, who was serving a one-match ban for his sending off at Enfield, while Simon Stapleton and Jimmy Dack were both out of contention through injury, although it appeared that they were no longer guaranteed a place in the starting line-up anyway. However, the Shots' most consistent player, Jason Chewins, was, so he returned from suspension to replace Terry Howard in the back three, while Ian Hathaway continued in Chewins' more normal left wing-back position. Despite these slight problems though, it was Aldershot who had the first chance of the match in the 13th minute when Jimmy Sagrew swung over a useful first-time cross for Gary Abbott to get his head to, but the ball went narrowly wide. However, Dagenham and Redbridge hit back just 2 minutes later when the powerfully built Danny Shipp hit a dipping shot from long range which again went narrowly wide, but Gary Phillips may well have had it covered anyway. In general though, the first half an hour of this match was very tight, with both defences giving very little away, and because of the rather unsatisfactory vantage point for the camera at Dagenham's ground, the action in the dugouts often seems to be more entertaining than what we can see on the pitch. Unfortunately though, the beady eye of the law is often used by opposing clubs in this division to stop George Borg motivating his players with so-called industrial language, and maybe Dagenham and Redbridge were up to the same trick here, although their manager Ted Hardy is apparently just as bad. However, the players on the pitch didn't appear to be listening to either of them, as it was a largely uneventful and indeed scoreless first half, with Dagenham forward Paul Cobb's rather mis-hit cross shot a minute before the break probably being the best chance of the half, as he had got clear of the Aldershot defence. Presumably, George Borg could swear at his players without police interference in the dressing room during the interval though, as Aldershot started the second half quite positively, with Jimmy Sagrew getting in a reasonable effort at goal after only 30 seconds, although it was always swerving wide. However, it was Gary Phillips who had to make the first save by a keeper in the match so far when he got down low to his right in the 50th minute to pounce on a close-range prod from Lee Matthews after a bit of a scramble in the area. That was quite an easy one though really, but the save he had to make in the 57th minute certainly wasn't, as he did really well to beat out a fierce drive from the useful Mark Janney, as Dagenham and Redbridge suddenly started getting on top. In fact, Phillips then had to make another excellent save 5 minutes later when he flung himself to his right to tip away a cross shot from Matty Bird, and at that stage it looked as if it was just a question of how long Aldershot could hold out for. However, Gary Abbott came to the Shots' rescue in the 63rd minute with a goal admittedly against the run of play, but one in which he showed all the attributes of a real desire to score which few other strikers at this level can match, as he outmuscled defender Lee Matthews from Ian Hathaway's through ball, and then showed great composure to round England's semi-pro international keeper Paul Gothard before firing into the bottom corner. Dagenham and Redbridge then of course responded by making a couple of substitutions, and it was one of them, number 12 Darren Barry, who nearly managed to equalise for them in the 84th minute when he pounced on a disastrously underhit back pass from Ian Hathaway to hit a fierce drive from behind physio Phil Shedden's head, but Gary Phillips made another brilliant save to keep the Shots' slender lead intact. Indeed, they managed to hold on without too much trouble after that, and George Ball's delight on the final whistle was probably more a show of relief, as Dagenham and Redbridge had clearly been the better side in terms of chances created. However, Aldershot had certainly battled well and defended well, and considering Dagenham and Redbridge had only lost once in their previous 17 League and Cup matches, and that being against conference side Stevenage Borough, this was a highly satisfying victory for the Shots, no matter how lucky they might have been to achieve it. In fact, Aldershot's suddenly improved form continued the following Tuesday night with an emphatic 5-0 win at home to Chertsey in the League Cup second round replay. So that was 4 good wins in a row now without conceding a goal, meaning anything less than another win at home to bottom of the table Heybridge Swifts the following Saturday would be a major surprise. Indeed, Aldershot's injury problems had now cleared up to some extent, so that was allowing George Ball to field a reasonably settled side, with only one change being made from the game against Chertsey, as Lee Holsgrove returned to replace the injured Owen Cole. Heybridge, though, typical of a side struggling at the bottom, certainly had a problem when defender Liam Cutbush had to be substituted after only 8 minutes for what was presumably some sort of laceration to the groin area, this being caused by the studs of Neil Champion in this accidental challenge a couple of minutes earlier. Thankfully, the camera was on the wrong side of the ground to get a good look at what was actually wrong with Cutbush, but we certainly got a good view of an incident in the 16th minute when Terry Howard kicked Heybridge forward Nicky Simpson in the head in trying to clear an awkwardly bouncing ball. However, referee Andy Harvey actually blew for attention for the injury and not for a foul, which incensed some of the Heybridge players as they felt Howard had denied Simpson a clear run through on goal by unfair means. And looking at the replay, they had a fair point, as it certainly should have been a free kick for dangerous play at least. In fact, Mr Harvey even restarted the game by wrongly giving Aldershot a goal kick, and he showed more incompetence just a minute later when he didn't even speak to Heybridge midfielder Alex Fiddis after he committed arguably the worst challenge seen at the Rec for many a season, and one which could easily have ended Gary Smart's career. Not surprisingly then, George Ball wasn't too pleased, especially as Mr Harvey didn't actually give the foul at first, although the replay shows that he did have players obscuring his view. As for the actual football, well, that didn't really start until the 20th minute when Heybridge took a shock lead with the first real shot of the match as midfielder David Streetley fired in a spectacular effort from the edge of the area, which was met with applause and cheers from about 5 spectators, and they were all in the away team dugout. Of course, with Heybridge wearing shirts where it's almost impossible to see the numbers on their backs, it probably wasn't too much of a surprise to hear the goal scorer being read out as somebody else, but PA announcer Tim Noyes soon had plenty of time to check his information as referee Harvey went and pulled a calf muscle 7 minutes later, which caused a 5-minute delay as the officials waited for a replacement linesman to be found from the crowd, so that Mr Harvey's senior assistant Andy Porter could take over the whistle. Presumably William Strudwick was an Aldershot supporter then, as there didn't appear to be anyone from Heybridge in attendance apart from the players and management, judging from the silence that greeted their goal. In fact, their lack of support may well have prompted Heybridge into some time-wasting tactics already, or at least that was the opinion of most of the Shot supporters when the visitors' first-half substitute Wayne Adcock went down for lengthy treatment in the 36th minute after accidentally heading Neil Champion's elbow. Adcock, though, seemed to think he'd been hard done by, judging by his suspiciously retaliatory-looking challenge on Jimmy Sagrew just 3 minutes later, and although it wasn't quite on camera, we could see what his intentions were. Adcock was booked for that though, but stand-in referee Andy Porter annoyed Aldershot in the first minute of injury time at the end of the half when he sent off Gary Abbott for allegedly elbowing Adcock when it looked more like a flailing arm being used just to try and shrug off Adcock's irritating challenge. Obviously most referees would have just booked Abbott, which was probably fair enough looking at this replay, but then the controversial Adcock may well have made a meal of it just to compound matters. Needless to say, George Borg was furious with the decision and therefore wanted to send the video and a letter to the FA after the match to try and get Abbott off. But his rather irrational heat-of-the-moment post-match comment of how can a linesman have the authority to do something like that probably didn't do him any favours, and not surprisingly, nothing came of his appeal. Of course, Aldershot's players now had to be careful not to lose their heads after that, and indeed Neil Champion found himself going into Mr Porter's book almost as soon as the game restarted for a late challenge on Heybridge defender Ben Lewis. But guess who wanted to start an unnecessary confrontation? That number 15 again. By now, the home crowd were almost at boiling point because of Adcock's antics, but the standard of refereeing from both officials didn't help matters, and when Mr Porter totally ignored a possible bookable foul on Colin Fielder by Heybridge's Christian McLean in order to blow the half-time whistle instead, the sound of abuse from the terraces was almost deafening, and his subsequent surrounding by a much larger posse of stewards than normal was indeed a very wise move. As this was the Shot's last home game before Christmas though, the club realised that a number of supporters would be doing their shopping instead, especially with a team like Heybridge being the opposition, so they wisely decided to let all under-16s in free of charge in order to boost the crowd, and it certainly worked, with an excellent 1,966 being announced as the total attendance. However, they'd hardly seen any football at all so far, while all these contentious incidents had worked in Heybridge's favour, with them being a goal up and now only having to face 10 men for the rest of the match. So George Borg brought on Joe Narty for the start of the second half to replace Jimmy Sagru and changed to a 4-3-2 formation, and that obviously made a difference as Heybridge keeper Kingsley Banks was finally forced into his first save of the match in the 52nd minute when he flew to his right to tip away a shot on the turn from Roy Young. However, it wasn't too long before the controversial incidents resurfaced, with Wayne Adcock involved yet again in the 57th minute when he rolled around on the ground clutching his chest after Colin Fielder rather deliberately caught him on the foot. Fielder no doubt escaping a yellow card by fooling referee Porter with his apparently sympathetic reaction, albeit laced with a sort of hidden sarcasm. Needless to say, when Adcock got to his feet after what turned out to be a blatant 3-minute time-wasting session, he then started holding his groin, which appeared to confirm that he was indeed acting. In fact, George Borg had suffered from Adcock using these tactics for Heybridge before when Borg was manager at Enfield, and that game ended up with Adcock having a punch-up with one of Borg's coaching staff because they were so fed up with his outrageous behaviour. But the Shots finally saw the back of him for this game when he went off in the 60th minute clutching his stomach after trying a shot which went 30 yards over the bar, and not surprisingly he wasn't exactly applauded off the pitch. Of course, Heybridge brought on a more defensively minded player to replace him, so George Borg immediately decided to really go for it by pushing Terry Howard up front in what was now a 4-2-3 formation, and that almost paid off in the 68th minute when substitute Joe Narty did really well to battle his way into the area, but then tried a shot from a ridiculously acute angle which keeper Banks blocked at his near post, with an annoyed Howard in a good position for a cutback. Obviously, Borg thought the Shots needed even more of an attacking option though after seeing that chance missed, so midfielder Kieran Philpott was brought on in place of defender Gary Smart in the 70th minute, and 3 minutes later Heybridge keeper Banks was forced into a much more difficult save, especially as Ian Hathaway's rare right-footed shot took a big deflection off Roy Young, but Banks managed to tip it over with the help of the top of the crossbar to leave Aldershot frustrated again. In fact, Banks then made another outstanding save just seconds later when he got down low to his right to block a diving header from Roy Young after Colin Fielder had driven in a first-time cross. However, Aldershot's 10 men continued to lay siege to the Heybridge goal, and they were unlucky again in the 77th minute when Neil Champion hit the top of the crossbar with Banks struggling this time, although whether it was a shot or a cross only he will know. Despite their man advantage though, Heybridge couldn't hold out forever under that sort of pressure, and Aldershot finally managed a more than deserved equaliser in the 83rd minute with what must have been a goal of the season contender, as Ian Hathaway weaved his way past 4 defenders in a brilliant solo run from the halfway line before crossing for Roy Young to volley in spectacular fashion, before undertaking the usual shots goal scorer's ritual at the East Bank end, while of course risking a broken neck and a booking in the process. Fortunately, Young received neither, but he had given his side hope that they could still go on and win this match. But unfortunately, it rather fizzled out after that, and Aldershot started getting really frustrated, especially Gary Phillips in the second minute of injury time, when he ended up getting booked for pushing Colin Wall to the ground in an attempt to retrieve the ball and get on with the game, although there actually could have been 4 or 5 players booked from the incident with a stricter referee in charge. Of course, having said that, it was Mr Porter's overzealous decision to send off Gary Abbott, which in the end cost Aldershot the 3 points, or at least that was the opinion of George Borg afterwards. However, the Shots actually played better without him, as they didn't have a single worthwhile shot while Abbott was on the pitch, and if it wasn't for some blatant time wasting, some excellent saves from keeper Kingsley Banks, and the fact that Heybridge continued to have the sort of luck they'd had in previous meetings with the Shots, a 3rd league victory in a row would have been accomplished. However, Heybridge were of course bottom of the table, and Aldershot certainly couldn't afford to play with 10 men in a Hampshire derby match at Basingstoke on the bank holiday Monday over Christmas. As usual though, George Borg was forced into making a change to his line-up as Jimmy Segru had gone down with flu, but defender Owen Cole was able to return after injury, so that meant Jason Chewins could play in his more favoured left wing-back position, with Ian Hathaway, who'd been making the odd mistake defensively while he'd been playing there, now free to move into a more forward role on the left, of which he's undoubtedly best suited to. However, Aldershot had to wait for an extra quarter of an hour before they could put that into practice, as the bumper crowd of 2,810 was about 5 times Basingstoke's average, and they were having trouble getting everyone through the turnstiles quickly enough. Once the game got underway though, it was Aldershot who had the first chance of the game after just 4 minutes, when their former player Tony Cleave gave away a free kick and got booked for it, leaving Ian Hathaway with the opportunity to whip over a good cross which Owen Cole headed straight at keeper Vince Matassa. However, Aldershot found themselves a goal down just 2 minutes later when skipper Terry Howard had a real nightmare as his badly underhit back pass was seized upon by Ian Mancy, who went on to force Gary Phillips into a good save with his legs, but Derek Simpson's shot from the rebound may well have been going wide until Howard diverted the ball into his own net in trying to redeem his original mistake. Of course, Simpson was given the goal by the Basingstoke PA announcer, which probably made Tim Noyes feel relieved, and no doubt Terry Howard to some extent, but it was a disastrous start to the match for the Shots, and they were in trouble at the back again in the 12th minute when Mark Xavier produced a clever piece of skill to beat Owen Cole, and then test Gary Phillips at his near post with a fierce drive from an acute angle. Although they were in mid-table, Basingstoke had lost 7 out of their last 9 league matches, so this was a game that Aldershot were expecting to win, and it certainly wasn't the start they wanted. But Gary Abbott gave them a bit of hope in the 28th minute with a combination of skill and determination to get in a shot out of nothing, but as with Owen Cole's earlier effort, it went straight at keeper Matassa. However, Basingstoke still looked dangerous up the other end from Matassa's eventual clearance, when wingback Mark Lisk burst clear of Gary Smart's challenge, for which Smart was ridiculously booked when the ball went out of play incidentally, but Gary Phillips came to the rescue again with another good save. In fact, Aldershot were a bit lucky to escape again in the 35th minute when Ian Mancy found a big gap in the Shots' defence to get in a shot, which Gary Phillips beat away before the whistle went for offside. However, Mancy looked to be level when Morley actually struck the ball, while number 7 Paul Wilkinson wasn't really interfering, and with Aldershot not trying to play the offside trap, it was clear that some of their defenders were losing their concentration. Indeed, that was clearly the case in the first minute of injury time at the end of the half when Terry Howard and Colin Fielder got themselves badly out of position, then tried to push up for offside, but then suddenly realised nobody was marking Mark Xavier, who fired over the bar when he should have hit the target at least. In fact, Fielder then tried to blame somebody else when he seemed to be the one most at fault. It was quite alarming to see so many mistakes being made at the back though, when George Borg's 3-5-2 formation had been working so well in the Shots matches since they first tried it against Enfield. However, it didn't work for them in that match, and maybe Basingstoke had also found a flaw in it. But no changes to the formation were made at half-time, with the introduction of Joe Narty for the strangely ineffective Roy Young just being a straight swap up front. Narty, though, certainly made a difference in the 52nd minute when he forced defender Andy Morley into a hurried clearance straight to Gary Abbott, who was really unlucky to see his clever chip clawed away by keeper Vince Matassa. Aldershot then managed to put the Basingstoke defence under more pressure in the 58th minute though, as Neil Champion made a positive run into the area to get over a dangerous low cross which could easily have been turned in by somebody, although Gary Abbott had actually strayed offside at the far post and rather unusually didn't complain about the decision. The Aldershot supporters were annoyed though, and they were even more furious in the 61st minute when referee Armstrong waved play on after Basingstoke's Mark Lisk had clearly fouled Gary Smart when he was in a good attacking position, and when that left the Shots outnumbered at the back from Andy Morley's clearance, it meant sweeper Colin Fielder had to challenge the gangling Ian Mancy in the air, which was obviously no contest, leaving Mark Xavier to run into the space Fielder had vacated, and with Owen Cole always trailing a yard behind him and struggling to keep up, when Xavier cleverly cut across him, it was always likely to end in a penalty and a sending off, even though it was never deliberate. Perhaps in hindsight, Fielder might have been better off letting Mancy win the header anyway and dropping off 5 yards to sweep up the obvious flick on before Xavier reached it, but that was no consolation to Cole, who was clearly a bit unlucky. But with Xavier clean through, Mr Armstrong really had no alternative but to reduce the Shots to 10 men for the second match running. Of course, with Tony Cleeve playing against his old club, he was doubly determined to score from the spot, and Aldershot therefore now found themselves 2-0 down, with only 10 men for the last half an hour, and really in a pretty hopeless position. However, Gary Abbott wasn't giving up, and he managed to pull a goal back just 45 seconds later with a brilliant finish after chesting down a long ball from Colin Fielder and outwitting defender Toby Redwood. In fact, Abbott was really unlucky not to equalise in the 77th minute, as the Shots produced a carbon copy of their courageous performance when they were reduced to 10 men in their last match against Heybridge. But Tony Cleeve was starting to become a bit of a hero for Basingstoke as well, as he cleared Abbott's header off the line from Ian Hathaway's corner to maintain his side's lead. Basingstoke were certainly living dangerously though, and they had another slice of luck just seconds later when Abbott was rather harshly flagged offside when he looked to be played on by defender Steve Richardson, and therefore clean through from Jason Chewin's through ball, and needless to say George Borg was soon out of his dugout. However, that turned out to be Aldershot's last real chance, and in general Basingstoke were better organised at the back than the Shots in this match, and that was the main reason they scraped through in the end, as in terms of possession it was a very even contest, but Aldershot just made too many mistakes defensively, including the sending off incident, and unfortunately that sort of thing had blighted their season so far, and they were now in grave danger of being forced to concede defeat in the title race. At least the supporters were still optimistic though, as a very healthy 2,270 turned up for the Shots' first home match of the new year against Dulwich Hamlet, although healthy is probably the wrong word to be using straight after the Christmas period. However, Aldershot's players had no real problems with injuries, illness or overindulgence, as George Borg fielded a side with just one change to the starting line-up, with 22-year-old striker Leon Gutsmore coming in for the suspended Gary Abbott, having been signed during the week for a club record £11,000 from Billericay. In the meantime, Joe Narty had gone on loan to Billericay as part of the same deal, while Jimmy Dack had now been sold back to his former club Sutton United, so Jimmy Sagrew and Stuart Cash returned to the 14 as substitutes. Rather surprisingly though, Borg continued with his 3-5-2 formation, albeit with Ian Hathaway in a more central role this time, while in attack Gutsmore and Roy Young had a chance to form an effective partnership without any real fear of losing their places in the side, as Abbott was now out for the next 4 matches because of his so-called elbowing offence in the Shots' last home game. With Dulwich down in 15th place and having only won once in their last 6 league matches, Aldershot were no doubt hoping that their defence wouldn't get quite as stretched as it had against Basingstoke, but they found themselves in a bit of trouble as early as the 7th minute, when Tony Houghton found space in the area to get over a dangerous cross towards the unmarked Richard Thompson, but Colin Fielder just managed to get back in time to make an important clearance. However, Aldershot almost went into a fortunate 12th minute lead when a challenge in the area between Roy Young and defender Gary Hewitt saw the ball bobble about off Young's heel amongst other assorted appendages before trickling just the wrong side of the post. However, the shots did manage to go in front from the ensuing corner when Colin Fielder headed in at the near post from Ian Hathaway's in-swinger. Or so everyone thought after seeing his celebrations, but the video reveals a different story, as the ball clearly comes off the head of Dulwich's number 8 Steve McKim, with Fielder actually ducking to get out of the way, and although the ball may then have brushed off any number of other players, it was certainly McKim who got the most decisive touch. No doubt Fielder slipped club secretary Graham Brookland a fiver then, as it was still being credited as his goal at the end of the season. However, the most important thing was that the shots were in front, and with Dulwich fielding a diamond formation in midfield, which included the grossly overweight Peter Garland in a holding role, presumably because he couldn't run very much, Aldershot started to get on top quite easily, with Garland wearing number 11 already labouring as Ian Hathaway cut inside to test keeper Les Cleveley in the 25th minute. With Garland obviously having overindulged during the Christmas period, there was a suspicion that he was only in the Dulwich side because his father Dave was their manager, and indeed he was making the likes of Terry Howard look like an Olympic athlete. In fact, Howard obviously started getting ideas beyond his station because of that, as he appeared on the left wing in the 27th minute to deliver a perfect cross, which new signing Leon Gutsmore should have buried, unless Dulwich defender Tony Chin actually got a slight touch to the cross first to put him off. However, Dulwich keeper Les Cleveley was tested again in the 34th minute when he flew to his right to tip away a superbly struck long-range shot from Neil Champion. In fact, Aldershot then had 2 more half chances within the space of 3 minutes just after that, before Owen Cole put them 2-0 up in the 37th minute after barging his teammate Terry Howard out of the way to head in another accurately taken corner from Ian Hathaway. It was real one-way traffic now, and the shots were a bit unlucky not to be given a penalty just seconds later, when Dulwich midfielder Steve McKim rather blatantly used his forearm just inside the area to cut out a cross from Jason Chewins. Obviously everyone in the family stand appealed, as they and the camera had an excellent view, but presumably referee Moore and indeed George Borg were unsighted. Certainly there was no sign of any steam coming from the home dugout, but then Borg didn't need to get himself worked up in this match as his side were playing well, and they forced keeper Cleveley into yet another good save in the 42nd minute as Roy Young got in a well-struck shot on the turn from an Ian Hathaway pass. With Dulwich weak in midfield because of Peter Garland's lack of fitness, Neil Champion and Ian Hathaway were having a field day, with Champion winning the ball and Hathaway doing real damage with it. And once again it was a Hathaway pass which set up Leon Gutsmore with a chance to brilliantly turn defender Tony Chin in the 44th minute, but keeper Cleveley positioned himself well to make his 5th good save of the match already. Perhaps Gutsmore could have done better with the finish though, but he made amends practically right on the half-time whistle when he put Aldershot 3-0 up after Ian Hathaway had been presented with a second chance to cross the ball after some dreadful defending, and that saw Terry Howard head the ball across for Gutsmore to score on his debut with an easy finish on the goal line. Not surprisingly then, Dulwich made a double substitution for the start of the second half, with Peter Garland being one of the players to go off, while manager Dave Garland switched to a sort of 3-4-1-2 formation with a number of players changing positions. However, it didn't seem to make much difference early on, as Aldershot had another clear-cut chance just 4 minutes into the half when Leon Gutsmore ran onto a long punt from a spectator to get in a shot which keeper Cleveley again managed to keep out thanks to some good positioning. However, Dalic's rearranged formation did indeed see them getting back into the game after that, and they made it 3-1 in the 62nd minute when Dave Stevens beat what was presumably an attempted offside trap from Steve McKimm's through ball, before shrugging off Colin Fielder's challenge and producing a good finish into the bottom corner. That appeared to be just a one-off though, as Dalic hadn't created any major chances before that, but they did have the shots in a bit of trouble just a minute later when Gary Phillips had to come right to the edge of his area to claim a headed through ball while his defenders hesitated. However, the slow-motion replay reveals that Phillips actually handled the ball almost a foot outside his area at first, before craftily dragging it back in, and with forward Richard Thompson clean through on goal, Phillips clearly should have been sent off. Obviously that would have caused Aldershot some problems with no substitute keeper on the bench, and they were certainly lucky that Phillips was still on the pitch in the 68th minute when he superbly tipped over a point-blank range header from Carl Bartley from a Dave Stevens corner. Dalic were now actually looking worryingly capable of pulling back the 2-goal deficit, especially when they had another chance in the 73rd minute, as substitute Tim Griggs found himself running clear of a square defence, but he panicked a bit under pressure from Terry Howard and blasted his shot high and wide. Although Dalic had raised their game, it did look as if Aldershot had been relaxing too much on their 3-0 half-time lead, so Jimmy Sagru was therefore brought on in a straight swap for Gary Smart on the right of midfield in the 75th minute to regain some urgency to the Shots play, and indeed Sagru made an impact straight away when he was involved in a move just seconds later which saw Leon Gutsmore volley Ian Hathaway's cross into the side netting at the far post, this being Aldershot's first real chance for nearly half an hour. In fact, it was Gutsmore who had what turned out to be the last chance of the game in the 86th minute, when Jimmy Sagru once again provided Ian Hathaway with a chance to get over another cross, which this time Gutsmore met with a better volley which forced keeper Cleveley into a save this time, and yet another good one at that. In the end then, it was probably the introduction of Sagru which ensured Aldershot's victory, as his exuberance pinned Dalic back in their own half and forced them to defend for the rest of the match, thereby enabling the Shots' excellent first half display to prove decisive in terms of the goal scoring. However, after such an entertaining match in which Aldershot created so many chances, their supporters and indeed George Borg must have been wondering why they couldn't produce this sort of performance on a more consistent basis. In fact, their next match away to Division 1 side Berkhamsted Town in the League Cup the following Tuesday night saw another erratic display where they conceded 3 goals but managed to scrape a replay, although they were missing a number of key players for that one, but they were all back for the following Saturday's league game at Gravesend and Northfleet, and in fact George Borg fielded the same starting line-up and formation that had convincingly beaten Dulwich Hamlet the previous Saturday. However, with midfielder Simon Stapleton now having been released by the club because he was a bit of a luxury player and didn't have the right attitude, according to Borg, it did give a chance for 18-year-old youth team winger Sam Cobbett to be named as one of the substitutes, as indeed he had been in midweek against Berkhamsted when he came on and made a promising debut. With a number of other matches having been called off due to waterlogged pitches, it was a bit of a surprise that this game was allowed to go ahead, as the playing surface was very heavy and certainly nothing like the bowling green of a pitch that the Shots are used to at the recreation ground. In fact, the actual stadium was a bit dilapidated as well, with old-fashioned pillars everywhere, which made it almost impossible to find a decent vantage point to film the game from, and indeed we can only assume that it was Ian Hathaway who supplied the pass for Neil Champion to get in a reasonable shot at goal after just 75 seconds. However, Gravesend missed a good chance to take the lead in only the 4th minute when a clever first-time flick from Martin Buglioni allowed Phil Dean to get in on goal, but he produced a woeful finish which certainly let Owen Cole off the hook, as he was supposed to be marking him with Colin Fielder sweeping. In fact, that had been quite a problem with the 3 at the back system, as there had been several occasions during the season so far when Fielder found himself having to mark because his other 2 central defenders had lost their concentration. However, they did their jobs properly a minute later, but unfortunately Jason Chewins didn't quite do his, as Gravesend winger Jimmy Ballard managed to get behind him to fire in a dangerous cross shot towards the near post, which forced Gary Phillips into a smart save. With Gravesend playing exactly the same formation though, perhaps they were having the occasional problem with it as well, as they gave away a rather needless penalty after only 8 minutes when defender Corey Campbell stopped Leon Gutsmore's determined run into the area with a blatant foul challenge from behind. Presumably, referee John Keegan thought that a 1-0 lead for the Shots would suffice without Campbell receiving a booking for that, but it didn't turn out that way as Colin Fielder hit the spot kick too close to keeper Darren Smith, who guessed the right way and made a fairly comfortable save. Of course, Aldershot were then really made to pay for that miss as Gravesend took the lead in the 13th minute when Lee Holsgrove totally missed the ball from a throw-in, leaving Andy Adibawali with plenty of time to pick out the unmarked Phil Dean, who headed in from close range with Gary Phillips doing his best to keep it out but not having much luck. However, it was a dreadful mistake from Holsgrove and whoever was supposed to be marking Dean, but with mid-table Gravesend in erratic form themselves, it wasn't too much of a surprise that Aldershot managed to equalise just 6 minutes later, although it was more from their own making rather than being presented with gifts from opposing defenders, as Roy Young finished off a patient move by out-jumping Gravesend skipper Mark Newson to head in from 6 yards. Unfortunately though, that comeback didn't last for long as the Shots went and let in another soft-looking goal in the 25th minute when Gravesend's Matt Chaplin swung over an admittedly well-flighted cross, but the Aldershot defence, including Gary Phillips, were far too hesitant in dealing with it, and Bruce Sewell therefore nipped in to make it 2-1. With Gravesend fielding a severely depleted side with a number of key players missing, that goal no doubt gave them a lot of confidence, and they created another couple of half chances shortly after that. However, Aldershot had a better effort in the 34th minute when Roy Young got his head to a Gary Smart cross, but keeper Smith made a good save diving to his right. Young, in fact, was clearly determined to keep his place in the side, with Gary Abbott due back from suspension soon, and he had another reasonable effort at goal in the 42nd minute, which wasn't too far wide. Gravesend's best player in the first half, though, was midfielder Bruce Sewell, who was giving Neil Champion a bit of a torrid time, as he'd already outwitted him to score Gravesend's second goal, and then did so again a minute before half-time, before rather wasting the shot this time. But the fact that Sewell had been playing as a journeyman defender of limited pace in recent seasons was a bit embarrassing for Aldershot, although the first half had been a fairly even contest, and the Shots were a bit unlucky to find themselves behind. However, if George Borg was telling Champion during the interval to get tighter on Sewell in the second half, then he obviously wasn't listening, as Sewell left him trailing in his wake again just a minute after the break, with another good burst from midfield to run onto Phil Dean's pass. But on this occasion, the Shots were glad they were playing on a churned-up pitch rather than their own immaculate surface back at the Rec, as they may well have found themselves 3-1 down otherwise. However, Sewell wasn't finished there, as just 3 minutes later he was first to the ball in midfield again before playing a perfect through ball into Phil Dean's path, but Gary Phillips came to Aldershot's rescue with an excellent save. On seeing how foolhardy that attempted offside trap was though, George Borg decided to change to a 4-4-2 formation in the 54th minute by bringing on Jimmy Sagrew in place of sweeper Colin Fielder. But the Shots still got themselves into a terrible mess at the back a couple of minutes later when they were far too slow to cover after a disputed throw-in didn't go their way, as they seemed to forget that Fielder wasn't there anymore, and it ended up with Jason Chewins clearly bringing down Martin Buglioni in the area, although referee Keegan didn't intentionally play the advantage, which allowed Jimmy Ballard to get in a shot which Terry Howard blocked, and with Craig Wilkins wasting the rebound, Aldershot were extremely lucky not to find themselves further behind after that escapade. At least Aldershot managed to steady themselves at the back for the next 20 minutes though, but they didn't even create any half chances themselves at the other end, so Sam Cobbett was brought on for Neil Champion in the 76th minute, which saw a much more attacking line-up in an effort to get back into the game. However, it was Gravesend who had another clear-cut chance just a minute later, as Martin Buglioni whipped in a cross on the turn which was too fast for the camera, but judging by the respective players' reactions, it saw Gary Phillips having to make a brilliant save to stop an own-goal own goal. That was a blow for any witty headline writers from the local press then, but the Gravesend scribes were having plenty to write about anyway, and they nearly had a third home goal to describe from the resulting corner, which Jimmy Ballard seemed to deliberately try and score with, and certainly if Gary Phillips had missed it, Martin Buglioni would have scored on the line anyway, as nobody was bothering to mark him. In fact, Ballard then tried to catch Phillips out again in the 83rd minute with, including corners, what must have been his fourth apparent shot from a crossing position in the match so far, although some of them may well have been sliced because of the state of the pitch. However, Ballard was eventually signed by West Ham later on in the season, although presumably not for his finishing ability, judging by the way he squandered another chance in the 87th minute after being put through by substitute Paul Booth. But he'd certainly given Jason Chewins a torrid time, and not many players have been doing that so far this season. Aldershot's biggest problem in this match though was that they kept giving the ball away too much, either from aimless clearances when they had time to look up and pick out colleagues, getting caught in possession by trying to dribble the ball too much on a muddy surface, or worst of all because of some dreadful passing, especially when they were trying to play the ball out from defence, and that was how that previous chance came about, with Gary Smart the main culprit. Of course that resulted in Aldershot's heads going down badly, and Gravesend should have capitalised on that to make their victory even more emphatic in the very last minute, but after a confident move, Andy Adeboali spoilt Paul Booth's clever backheel pass by producing a weak shot straight at Gary Phillips. Considering Gravesend were fielding a badly understrength side then, this had turned out to be arguably Aldershot's worst performance of the season so far, especially in the second half when they couldn't manage a single shot at goal. In fact, Gravesend had missed 5 clear-cut chances in that second half, and the shots could easily have ended up suffering their heaviest defeat of the season. So it was quite amazing to hear some travelling supporters encouraging the players as they trooped off at the end, as the followers of most other clubs would have stormed out of the ground in disgust. Of course that result more or less put paid to Aldershot's chances of winning the league, so the following Saturday's FA Trophy match at home to Ryman League Division 1 side Maidenhead United suddenly became a lot more important. However, with Owen Cole and Lee Holsgrove both cup-tied, Gary Abbott still suspended, and the likes of Mark Harper, Jimmy Dack and Simon Stapleton having recently been released by the club, George Borg was virtually naming the only players he had left as his starting 11, with all 3 substitutes being inexperienced youngsters. Surprisingly though, Borg was still persisting with the 3-5-2 formation, so he obviously felt there was something wrong with the players, not the actual system, and maybe the inclusion of his assistant Stuart Cash in defence and Jason Chewins in an unfamiliar midfield holding role might make it work properly on this occasion. Maidenhead, of course, were one of the Shot's main rivals for the Division 1 title the previous season, and they actually won here in the league during that campaign, so this was always likely to be a close game, and indeed the first chance of the match didn't come until the 19th minute, when Leon Gutsmore headed down an Ian Hathaway cross at the far post, but Gary Smart couldn't control his half volley and the ball bounced miserably wide from a good position. In fact, the first shot on target of the match didn't come until the 28th minute, but once again it was Aldershot who took the initiative, with Neil Champion making a positive run at the Maidenhead defence, but keeper Kieran Drake was able to smother his shot fairly comfortably, diving to his left. With Maidenhead being managed by former West Ham and England winger Alan Devonshire, you would have expected them to have included at least some players with a bit of skill and ability, and for the side to play with a bit of flair, but instead their lineup was packed with 6-foot-plus Neanderthals who were content to defend in numbers and then try and score from long throw-ins by barging Gary Phillips into the net, illegally of course, or at least according to referee Habgood. In fact, judging by their tactics in this game, it was a bit surprising that Maidenhead didn't have a player booked until the 35th minute, but when Luke Evans scythed down Leon Gutsmore, the yellow card was inevitable. Indeed, it was also inevitable that at some stage Maidenhead would give away a free kick in a good position for the Shots, as they were defending very deep, but they might have been a bit unlucky to be penalised for handball right on the edge of the area in the 36th minute, as number 10 Mickey Crichton was jumping with his back to the ball, and it was only clever skill from Jimmy Sagru which made it hit his elbow. However, most referees tend to give handball for that sort of thing anyway, but not everyone can punish the opposition as harshly as Sagru did, as his brilliant strike from the free kick was inch perfect to beat keeper Drake all ends up. In fact, he even managed to place it accurately enough to get it over the head of defender Vernon Pratt on the goal line, and with Pratt standing almost 7 feet tall, that was some achievement. Pratt, in fact, was booked for dissent for some reason before the game restarted, but his teammate Luke Evans clearly should have been sent off in the 43rd minute for a dreadful two-footed challenge on Leon Gutsmore, which sparked off quite a melee. Evans, of course, had already been booked, but it could well have been a straight red card offence, although referee Habgood may not have seen it because he was either looking at Vernon Pratt, having just penalised him for holding Gutsmore a split second beforehand, or Jimmy Sagrew was in his line of vision for the Evans foul. Even so, it did look like woefully weak refereeing not to take any action at all, and Evans escaped to continue Maidenhead's attempted comeback in the second half. However, apart from that incident when they bundled Gary Phillips into the net, Maidenhead hadn't created a single chance in the first half, and indeed it was Aldershot who had the first chance after the break when Leon Gutsmore got in a good header from a Neil Champion cross in the 50th minute, but keeper Drake made a good save for the cameras in diving to his right. In fact, Maidenhead then nearly gifted Aldershot a second goal in the 53rd minute when midfielder Steve Brown tried a ridiculously ambitious backward header towards his own goalkeeper, which Roy Young got to first quite easily, but he couldn't get enough distance on his attempted lob, although defender Tim Cook did give him a second chance, but he was then off balance too much to really take advantage. However, Maidenhead were then presented with a similar chance themselves in the 56th minute when Chuck Agadozie intercepted an under-hit back pass from Terry Howard, but Gary Phillips came quickly off his line to divert the shot off for a corner. Of course, that was actually Maidenhead's first shot of the match, but they tested Phillips again just a minute later, although Abina Alassi's effort was more likely an overhit cross. However, Maidenhead were now evidently thinking that they could get back into the game as they made 3 substitutions at various intervals in the next 15 minutes or so, which did give them a more attacking formation. But when they brought Dwayne Ackerman on for Luke Evans in the 75th minute, it was obviously like for like, as Ackerman should have been booked just seconds after coming on for a late challenge on Roy Young, which left the shots forward needing lengthy treatment before he could continue. However, referee Habgood didn't even speak to Ackerman, and indeed Maidenhead nearly had another slice of luck in the 85th minute when defender Tim Cook hit the bar from an acute angle with Gary Phillips beaten, although it was almost certainly an overhit cross again. In fact, that turned out to be Maidenhead's best chance of the match, as Aldershot survived to go through to the next round in what was a really poor game to watch. However, that wasn't really Aldershot's fault, as Maidenhead were well organised and very physical defensively, but their only chances in this match came for overhit crosses or bad back passes, and they certainly didn't produce anything anywhere near as good as Jimmy Sagrew's winner, which was the only decent bit of skill in the whole match. Indeed, the only thing impressive about Maidenhead was their supporters' massive banner tied to the East Bank fencing, and it was quite ironic that a manager who was known for his outstanding skill in his playing days could now put out a side to play like this. Of course, that quite often happens in football, as George Borg was apparently a very average, no-nonsense defender at Millwall in his playing days, but as a manager he clearly puts a side out to win every match, and with a bit of style as well, although that wouldn't be easy at struggling Hampton the following Saturday, as they were in danger of relegation and therefore determined not to lose. At least Aldershot had a slightly stronger side out for this one though, as Lee Holsgrove returned after being cup-tied, while Gary Abbott had now served his suspension but was named as a substitute, presumably because Borg felt Roy Young and Leon Gutsmore had played well enough in his absence and didn't deserve to be dropped. However, with Owen Cole now suspended for his sending off at Basingstoke, Holsgrove had to play in the back 3 on this occasion, with Jason Chewins continuing in the midfield holding role. But as with all the Shot's recent matches, their supporters really didn't know what to expect all the time Borg persevered with this formation. Of course, after the boring spectacle against Maidenhead, it was hoped that they would have one of their good days, but Hampton soon put a stop to that idea as they packed their defence and totally killed the game in a scoreless first half, although Aldershot didn't help matters by playing into their hands with a succession of poor crosses and dead ball kicks straight down the throats of Hampton's very capable central defenders, although one of them, Peter Barnsby, was booked in the 43rd minute for appearing to elbow Leon Gutsmore in one aerial challenge, and that was the only real talking point in the first 45 minutes. Indeed, with neither keeper having had a serious save to make, it was no wonder there were at least 2 spectators yawning during the half-time interval, although it's unlikely any players were in the Aldershot dressing room, as George Borg was probably giving them a bit of a roasting, and indeed Gary Abbott was therefore brought on for the start of the second half to liven things up a bit. In fact, with Neil Champion going off, it meant quite a drastic reshuffle, with Gary Smart, Lee Holsgrove, Jimmy Sagrew and Ian Hathaway all moving into different positions to accommodate what was now a 3-4-3 formation. But Hampton went and changed their formation to cope with it, and indeed they had the first decent shot of the half and the match in the 55th minute, when midfielder Jesse Hall suddenly burst past 3 Aldershot defenders to get in a shot, which narrowly missed the far post as Gary Phillips came hurtling off his line. However, Aldershot gradually started to improve after that, and they produced an excellent move in the 62nd minute when Ian Hathaway sent a clever outside of the foot through ball into Roy Young's path, with his cross being headed narrowly over the bar by substitute Gary Abbott. Aldershot did have a blow when Leon Gutsmore limped off in the 69th minute though, and with Kieran Philpott coming on it meant Jimmy Sagrew was moved up front, but nonetheless the shots did create a good chance in the 72nd minute when Lee Holsgrove teed up Ian Hathaway for a first time shot, but although it looked spectacular he should have kept it down more and perhaps hit the target. However, Holsgrove showed Hathaway how to do it in the 81st minute when from Hathaway's corner he managed to get in a fierce drive on the turn at the far post, which forced Hampton keeper Mark Russell into what turned out to be the only worthwhile save by either keeper in the match. In fact, Hampton, despite being the home side, actually appeared to be happy with a goalless draw, as they made 2 time-wasting substitutions in the last few minutes in order to ensure this result, although they did have to endure 6 minutes of injury time due to players going down with cramp because of all the sand on the pitch, and really it was probably the poor state of the playing surface which was the main factor in this being such a non-eventful match. Another factor from the shots point of view though was that George Borg was rarely able to field the same side 2 matches running, due mainly to players being cup-tied or suspended, although the changes he made for the League Cup third round replay at home to Berkhamsted Town the following Tuesday night appeared to be of his own choice in order to experiment somewhat. That meant Gary Smart, Sam Cobbett and Gary Abbott were all named in the starting lineup for this replay, having missed the first match, with Stuart Cash, Kieran Philpott and Neil Champion being left out. In fact, with this match not being quite as important as FA Trophy or League matches in terms of prestige, it was a good opportunity for Borg to have a look at the 4-4-2 system for the first time in a number of weeks, with the midfield quartet being the most interesting selection. Of course, with Berkhamsted having lost 3-0 at home to Maidenhead in their last match and struggling to avoid relegation in Division 1, Borg was expecting a good start from his players, and indeed they got it in the very first minute when Berkhamsted's Rory Bray was booked after just 35 seconds for a foul on Gary Smart, and from the resulting free kick, Jimmy Sagrew and Ian Hathaway worked to move down the right, which saw Sagrew's cross headed onto the bar by Gary Abbott, before Roy Young hooked in the rebound from an almost impossible angle to put the shots 1-0 up, with the ball hitting the back of the net precisely 85 seconds after the kick-off. However, Aldershot had to wait until the 16th minute for their next effort at goal as Roy Young let fly from just outside the area, with the ball flashing narrowly wide. With a lot of surface water on the pitch though, the ball was holding up at times, but that didn't appear to affect Aldershot when Gary Abbott missed a good chance to make it 2-0 in the 23rd minute after finding himself right in front of goal from Jason Chewin's low cross, as it was more of a poor first touch which saw the ball get stuck under his feet a bit, although it was a good save by keeper Nicky Webb. Berkhamsted, though, were making no effort to get back into the match, and they seemed content just to defend deep and try and keep the score down. So that saw Aldershot dominate possession but create very few chances, with this effort from Gary Abbott in the 32nd minute being their only other worthwhile shot of the first half. George Borg, though, wasn't really happy with that, as he felt his side should have built more on their early lead, so Neil Champion was brought on at the start of the second half for Sam Cobbett to raise the tempo a bit in midfield, but it was defender Terry Howard who had the shot's first effort of the half, when his first time shot from distance in the 52nd minute flew just wide, with keeper Webb beaten. In fact, Aldershot came close again just 2 minutes later when Roy Young's glancing header from an Ian Hathaway cross seemed to stick in the mud in the goal mouth before diverting wide, with keeper Webb obviously not having touched the ball, with a goal kick being given. Those two chances suggested Aldershot had now come to life after that half-time substitution, but with the crowd only being half the average, presumably because of a freezing cold wind whipping into the ground from the open High Street end, and the fact that this game had been in doubt because of a waterlogged pitch, the players seemed to be affected by the lack of atmosphere and returned to going through the motions a bit for the rest of the half, although Ian Hathaway came close with a first-time shot in the 66th minute, which again had keeper Webb diving about, but once more it ended up off target. Maybe Aldershot's newly found free kick expert Jimmy Sagru could find the net then, when he was given an opportunity to repeat his strike against Maidenhead from a similar distance in the 68th minute, but again it only resulted in Webb being beaten by a shot off target for something like the 7th time in the match so far. In general, though, this match had been played almost like a pre-season friendly, with very few fouls and only a couple of petty bookings, one of which came after just 35 seconds. But it suddenly boiled over in the 75th minute when Berkhamsted's Tony Cook committed a bad foul on Neil Champion, which resulted in Champion retaliating, and both players, not surprisingly, receiving a yellow card apiece. That presumably fired Aldershot up a bit then, as they created another chance just a minute later when the Berkhamsted defence made a mess of trying to clear a Jimmy Sagru free kick, which allowed Owen Cole to get in a close-range volley. But as usual in this match, it ended up narrowly off target, as keeper Webb practised his imaginary brilliant tip round the post again. In fact, he was probably hoping that Aldershot could get a shot on target so that he could keep his hands warm, but the chances of that were reduced somewhat a minute later when the Shots ended up having to play the remaining 13 minutes with only 10 men, as Neil Champion was sent off for a second bookable offence in fouling Berkhamsted midfielder Steve Bode, Champion obviously not having calmed down from the incident which led to his first booking a couple of minutes earlier. No doubt George Borg had a few choice words to say in the dressing room afterwards about Champion's lack of discipline there, and indeed Borg was also annoyed about his team's performance overall, as the game finished with just the one goal for the Shots against a very poor side who hadn't managed a meaningful effort at goal themselves all match. And on this evidence, Aldershot's defence must have had a nightmare in conceding 3 goals to Berkhamsted in the first match, which of course was not captured on video, and as Borg missed that match as well because of a flu bug, you have to wonder what exactly went on in his absence. At least Aldershot were through to the next round though, and in fact they were still in 3 other cup competitions, and because of a spate of postponements due to waterlogged pitches, those matches all piled up to such an extent that cup games were all they were playing for the next 2 weeks, the first of them coming against Sylvan Sports in the Hampshire Senior Cup the following Saturday, when as expected they totally outclassed the Guernsey-based side, with Gary Abbott scoring 4. However, it was then a totally different story away to Division 1 side Worthing 3 days later in the league's rather unnecessary Puma Cup competition, as George Borg treated this one as 1 cup too many and a game he could do without, so not one regular first-team player was fielded, as a collection of youth team players and hastily arranged signings from clubs lower down the non-league pyramid predictably crashed to a 6-0 defeat. Of course, some of the 200 or so supporters who travelled to Worthing were not amused, as they thought they'd be watching the first team. But the reason for Borg's decision was clearly the tough draw the Shots had received in the FA Trophy, as a trip to Wembley for the final of that competition was obviously a lot more appealing. But with Altrincham the visitors the following Saturday, Borg couldn't risk getting any of his first-choice players injured in a rather meaningless fixture beforehand, as Altrincham were currently top of the Unibond Northern Premier League and were clear favourites to regain their their place in the conference. However, Borg couldn't exactly field a full-strength side anyway, as Owen Cole, Lee Holsgrove and Leon Gutsmore were all cup-tied, but he was able to include new signing Russell Watkinson, a 21-year-old right-sided midfielder from Kingstonian, while Joe Narty had now returned from a successful loan spell at Billericay and was therefore named amongst the substitutes. Watkinson's inclusion in the starting lineup, though, meant Jimmy Sagrew had to play on the left, with Ian Hathaway starting in a central midfield role, as a 4-4-2 system was fielded after the defensive improvements that seemed to result from its use against Berkhamsted and presumably against Sylvan Sports. However, Altrincham were a completely different proposition, although they didn't threaten the Aldershot goal in the opening 20 minutes or so because they were too busy kicking Gary Abbott and Roy Young up in the air, particularly defender Paul Ellender, who was booked in the 23rd minute for 3 fouls on them within the space of about 30 seconds. Despite Ellender and his defensive colleagues being built more like rugby league players and wearing the same sort of shirts as them as well, Altrincham did have one player who was known more for his ability to kick a ball rather than an opponent, namely the former West Ham and Everton midfielder Mark Ward. But although his cross into the Aldershot area in the 29th minute was expertly flighted, it was dreadful defending by the Shots to let midfielder Ricky Harris run in totally unopposed to head Altrincham into the lead. In fact, Aldershot were very unconvincing at the back again in the 32nd minute as Ward floated over a corner this time, which Paul Ellender won far too easily and really should have scored, with Gary Phillips appearing to be either tripped or blocked by his own defenders. However, Altrincham then had another clear-cut chance to increase their lead just 2 minutes later when Ricky Harris and Leroy Chambers combined to cut their way through the centre of the Aldershot defence, but Keith Russell eventually flicked the ball wide as Gary Phillips came quickly off his line towards him. By now, Altrincham were looking quicker and sharper all round, and that was emphasised in the 36th minute when they deservedly went 2-0 up, as Keith Russell got in front of Jason Chewins to head in across from Leroy Chambers, with Gary Phillips rooted to the spot. It was a real nightmare spell for Aldershot, but they could have been thrown a lifeline in the 43rd minute if referee Keith Hill had been bold enough to show a second yellow card to Altrincham's Paul Ellender after yet another foul on Gary Abbott. But a lecture was all Ellender got, and Altrincham were perhaps a bit lucky to still have 11 men on the pitch. As usual though, Abbott ignored all the intimidation, and it wasn't a surprise to see him getting in what turned out to be Aldershot's only shot at goal in the first half 2 minutes later from Ian Hathaway's cross, and he was really unlucky that keeper Stuart Coburn just happened to be standing in the right place from Altrincham's point of view. Hathaway, though, had been having a hard time of it in his presumably less favoured central midfield position, as Altrincham were proving to be too strong and too sharp for him in there, and just seconds later he was crowded out again, and it could well have led to a third goal for Altrincham if Ricky Harris had kept his composure. However, the last piece of action in the first half was almost inevitably a booking for an Altrincham player for a foul on Gary Abbott, with their other central defender Chris Timmins being the culprit this time. With the half-time whistle going just seconds later then, George Borg was no doubt still seething, and with it being quite obvious that Altrincham were trying to kick Abbott out of the game because they knew he was a danger man, Borg made sure he reminded referee Hill of that as they walked off at the break, while a demand for some sterner action from Mr Hill was obviously being made as well. However, Borg's priority was to sort out his defence if he wanted to have any chance of getting back into this game, as they'd been gifting Altrincham far too many chances so far, but they certainly tightened up in the second half as they ended up denying their opponents a single worthwhile shot at goal, even after making a double substitution in the 58th minute which saw a major reshuffle, although Altrincham did sit back on their lead deliberately and looked quite capable of holding out easily until Aldershot substitute Joe Narty suddenly popped up in the 89th minute to convert Jimmy Sagrew's pass and make it 2-1 from the first chance of the half. Obviously, with 44 minutes of boredom having been produced before that goal, a large number of Aldershot supporters had gone home by now, but they were to miss quite an eventful last few minutes, and indeed the Shots could well have equalised just seconds later when Altrincham keeper Stuart Coburn produced a weak punch under pressure from Jimmy Sagrew's cross, but Colin Fielder lofted the loose ball high over the bar. In fact, Coburn then had to make a diving save in the second minute of injury time when somebody from a group of about 6 players got their head to a Neil Champion long throw, although from this angle it's impossible to tell exactly who. Unfortunately though, the last real talking point of the game came up the other end a minute later, when Gary Phillips somehow escaped a sending off, or even a booking for that matter, after clearly catching Leroy Chambers as he rushed out of his area. Chambers in fact doing well to try and stay on his feet and not make a meal of it like most players would have done. As the replay shows though, Phillips seemed to deliberately bring his left arm up to knock Chambers off balance once he'd realised he'd got past him, but referee Hill presumably played an advantage just because Chambers didn't go down straight away. However, it wasn't an advantage anyway because Jason Chewins got back to clear the danger, and with Chambers clean through on goal initially, it wasn't surprising that Altringham's players had a few choice words to say to Mr Hill when the game was finally stopped for an injury 2 minutes later. However, the final whistle went shortly afterwards anyway, and the better side on the day won in the end, with Altrincham proving to be as good if not better than the 4 Ryman League sides who had also beaten the Shots at home so far this season. And although Altrincham surprisingly didn't reach Wembley in this competition, they did end up winning their league and returning to the conference, and their performance in this match was of the level that George Borg really wanted the Shots to be at, and he was quite annoyed and frustrated afterwards that some of his more experienced players in particular had not been up to the task, and that more of them might have to go. However, only one was singled out as having played his last game for the club, with Gary Smart dropped for the League Cup quarter-final at Leatherhead the following Tuesday night and then subsequently being sold. So with Lee Holsgrove's loan spell from Wickham now having ended as well, Borg brought in defender Steve McGrath from Yeovil as a replacement, McGrath having played under Borg at Enfield in the past, and he made his debut in this match, helping the Shots to a narrow 1-0 victory on an icy pitch which probably should have been called off, as everyone, including the cameraman, assumed it would be. Or at least almost everyone, as a crowd of 416 still turned up, while for the Shots' next home game in the league against Bishop Stortford the following Saturday, 1,723 were in attendance, and with only a handful of them being Bishop Stortford fans, it was quite amazing that Aldershot supporters were still turning up in their droves, even though the club's season was disintegrating all the time in terms of winning trophies. In fact, because of that, George Borg was having a real clear-out now, with Kieran Philpott being released and Roy Young being sent to Billericay on loan this time, with Joe Narty now having returned from there. Indeed, Narty was now being preferred to the rather disappointing Leon Gutsmore in the starting line-up, as was Jimmy Sagrew for this match in preference to recent signing Russell Watkinson, while coming in for his debut was midfielder Steve Tallboys from Sutton United, Tallboys being a typical Borg signing in that he was a vastly experienced player in his early 30s who had played most of his football at a higher level. With Colin Fielder partnering Tallboys in the centre of midfield for this match then, it made the Shots very solid in that department, but with Owen Cole normally playing as a centre-half, it did look to be a bit of a risk in the right-back position. However, Bishop Stortford were bottom of the table, and Aldershot had already beaten them twice so far this season, although Stortford did now have a change of manager and only 2 players remaining from their starting line-up in their last meeting with the Shots. However, Aldershot had been on top straight away, as George Borg's early decision to switch Jimmy Sagrew onto the left and Ian Hathaway onto the right started playing dividends, with Hathaway getting in the first decent shot of the game after 12 minutes with a spectacular swerving effort which keeper Gavin King superbly tipped over the bar. However, Bishop Stortford did have a chance against the run of play in the 18th minute as Owen Cole tried to come to terms with his new position in the Shots' defence, but although Troy Braham found a yard of space because of that, his shot was too near Gary Phillips and Steve McGrath was on hand to clear the rebound. That was the signal for Aldershot to just up a gear though, and they took the lead in the 20th minute when Jimmy Sagrew curled an awkward low cross into the Stortford area, which was missed by Gary Abbott at the near post but not by Joe Narty running in at the far post. Narty though picked up a bizarre looking injury in scoring that goal, and judging from where physio Phil Shedden was putting that sponge, it's doubtful whether that was used again, and certainly not for a facial injury. However, Narty soon recovered, and just 4 minutes later he'd scored his and Aldershot's second, when Ian Hathaway easily skipped past defender Ernie Cooksey to provide the cross for Narty to bravely dive in front of his marker Scott Honeyball and head the ball home. In fact, Aldershot then should have increased their lead in the 31st minute when Jason Chewins put Gary Abbott in on goal with an excellent through ball, but Abbott uncharacteristically lobbed the chance wide of the far post, with keeper Gavin King stranded way off his line. Aldershot's most influential player of the first half so far, though, was Ian Hathaway, who was being given a lot more space in this game and was literally running rings round the Stortford defence and was obviously too quick and skillful for them. So with Stortford's players unable to get anywhere near him, they seem to be taking it out on the ageing and slightly less agile Colin Fielder instead, with Bradley Quinton's wild challenge on him in the 33rd minute ending up as Stortford's third booking of the game already, and all for fouls on Fielder. Hathaway, though, hadn't been fouled so far, and it didn't look as if he would be in the 40th minute either, as he tormented Stortford left-back Ernie Cooksey again by forcing him onto the back foot just inside the area, before picking out Joe Narty with another accurate low cross, Narty completing a first-half hat-trick with a simple finish, and now even looking to surpass the 5 goals he scored against Stortford in that 8-0 win earlier on in the season. However, his task would have been made much easier if Bishop Stortford's Bradley Quinton had been booked for a second time in the match and therefore sent off, after clearly catching Owen Cole in the face with what appeared to be an elbow in the 43rd minute. Indeed, Gary Abbott received a straight red card for a similar offence against Heybridge Swifts, because the so-called assistant referee in that match had taken over as the man in the middle, whereas in this game the assistant, despite having a perfect view of the incident, just kept his trap shut because he was still in reality just a linesman who is only supposed to flag for throw-ins and offsides. The name assistant referee, of course, only having been brought in because of the likes of Wendy Toms coming into the game, and apparently not to give a linesman more power. Having gone in at half-time 3-0 up then, it wasn't a surprise to see Aldershot have the first chance in the second half, as Bishop Stortford had trouble in clearing an Ian Hathaway free kick in the 51st minute, but new signing Steve McGrath hooked the loose ball just wide from close range. However, the Shots had an even better chance in the 55th minute when a first-time through ball from Hathaway drew keeper King way out of his goal, but Joe Narty beat him to it, only to see Stortford substitute Stuart Snowden get back to clear what was eventually a rather under-hit shot. With Bishop Stortford already under the cosh early in the second half then, it was probably no surprise to see them start losing their heads again like they did in their last match against the Shots, and indeed they soon had 2 more players booked for fouls within the space of a minute, before they were reduced to 10 men in the 65th minute, when Troy Braham was shown a straight red card by referee Keith Reynolds just for throwing the ball at Jimmy Sagrew, which did seem a bit harsh. However, nobody from Bishop Stortford seemed to complain too much, so they obviously realised the defeat was inevitable anyway and just couldn't be bothered. However, they might have been a bit more concerned if they'd have been reduced to 9 men just seconds later, when Stuart Snowden clearly held back Joe Narty, who was racing more or less clean through on goal, and even though referee Reynolds obviously tried to play the advantage because Narty had stayed on his feet, Snowden still should have been booked at least when the ball went out of play. In the meantime, Jimmy Sagrew had now swapped positions with Ian Hathaway again, and Bishop Stortford seemed to be caught out by that when they conceded another goal in the 72nd minute, as Hathaway was left in acres of space to run on and pick out Joe Narty again with yet another pinpoint cross, leaving Narty with a simple header to make it 4-0 to the Shots, and 10 in total against Bishop Stortford this season for Narty, as he'd also found the back of the net against them while on loan at Billericay. In fact, Narty seemed to have really gained in confidence from that loan spell, and he looked sharp again in the 78th minute as he made a well-timed run onto a Hathaway through ball, but keeper King denied him this time by making a good save, 10 yards outside his area. Amazingly though, referee Reynolds waved play on for what must have been one of the most blatant sending-off offences committed in the league all season, as King didn't just handball it with his right fist, he actually brought down Narty with his right leg at the same time. No doubt if it had been a close game there would have been some very heated protests about that decision, but Aldershot was so much on top that they were creating almost a chance a minute, and if anyone deserved a goal it was Ian Hathaway, and he really confused the Stortford defence in the 81st minute by cutting inside onto his right foot before drilling an excellent shot just narrowly over the bar with keeper King well beaten. Both sides then made substitutions shortly afterwards, with Leon Gutsmore coming on in place of Steve Tallboys for the shots, and the change to a more attacking 3-4-3 formation presumably helped Aldershot to a fifth goal in the 89th minute, with somebody else scoring this time instead of Joe Narty, namely Gary Abbott, who headed in a Jimmy Sagru cross with keeper King looking a bit suspect. That was basically it as far as the action in this match was concerned, but there was time for a strange-looking substitution when George Borg brought on Neil Champion for just 20 seconds before the full-time whistle went. Borg, in fact, having a habit of doing this, presumably either as a bit of a joke to wind up the player coming on, or, as seems more likely, to take a certain player off in the knowledge that the crowd will give that player a standing ovation and therefore boost his confidence. Certainly there was no need to time waste with such a comprehensive victory having been secured, and indeed Bishop Stortford were a beaten side even after about 25 minutes play, as Aldershot produced an excellent team performance with nobody having a bad game and all the new signings fitting in really well. Although Joe Narty was not surprisingly the focus of attention on the final whistle, the shot's real man of the match was probably Ian Hathaway, who had created 3 of Narty's goals and basically torn the Bishop Stortford defence apart in a display of real class, which very few other players in the division would be able to match, and it made you wonder why he wasn't still playing in the full-time professional game. Thankfully, Hathaway and Narty were both fit and raring to go again the following Tuesday night, as indeed was every other Aldershot player, as George Borg had the rare luxury of being able to field an unchanged line-up for the visit of a struggling Walton and Hersham side. However, Walton and Hersham took a shock lead after just 9 minutes when Steve McGrath seemed to think the ball was running out of play for a goal kick, but Andy Sayer managed to keep it in and Dean Canaville nipped in front of Terry Howard to convert the cross. At least Aldershot weren't put off by that though, as they managed to equalise just 3 minutes later with a rather comical goal, as Steve Tallboys' side-footed volley from an Ian Hathaway cross seemed to be half-sliced and somewhat overhit, but keeper Delroy Preddy went and fumbled the ball over the line as Joe Narty ran in towards him. While Walton and Hersham had an apparently dodgy goalkeeper though, Aldershot had some uncertain defenders at the start of this match, as Owen Cole made a bad mistake in the 19th minute when he passed the ball straight to Walton and Hersham's left winger Tommy Williams, who then easily rounded Cole to cross for the diminutive Andy Sayer to beat the shot's 3 other defenders in the air, with the ball going narrowly wide of the far post. In fact, the experienced Sayer was certainly causing Aldershot some problems with his clever running off the ball, and he again came close to scoring in the 22nd minute when he ran onto a Garfield Blackman through ball, but with Steve McGrath and Terry Howard totally caught out, Sayer went and chipped the ball wide of the far post, although Gary Phillips could take a lot of the credit for that. However, with Walton and Hersham attacking a lot more than most other visiting sides, it did make them vulnerable in getting caught on the break, and that's what happened in the 27th minute when Aldershot went into a 2-1 lead very much against the run of play, as Jimmy Sagru produced a brilliant run and cross for Joe Narty to volley in at the far post. After such a good goal, it was presumed that the shots would now start to take control, but they continued to live dangerously in defence, and they ended up conceding a penalty in the 36th minute when Terry Howard brought down Curtis Johnson with a rather reckless challenge about an inch inside the area. On the balance of play though, Aldershot couldn't really complain when Andy Sayer scuffed in the spot kick off the foot of the post to make it 2-2, especially as Walton and Hersham had also created a number of half chances just before this. That was how it stayed until half-time though, but if Aldershot had been a bit complacent in the first half after their 5-0 win against Bishop Stortford, then George Borg had obviously given them a roasting during the interval, as they made it 3-2 just 44 seconds after the restart, with Jimmy Sagru superbly controlling Ian Hathaway's awkwardly bouncing cross to turn and fire into the bottom corner. Up until that point it had been a reasonably clean game, with only a couple of bookings so far for Colin Fielder and Walton and Hersham's Curtis Johnson, both in the first half. But Walton forward Dean Cannaville took a bit of a risk in the 47th minute when he fouled Fielder in midfield and then pushed him in the chest as they tangled on the floor. Obviously that was more of a bookable offence, as Cannaville certainly hadn't thrown a punch, so when referee Clive Penton whipped out the red card to reduce Walton and Hersham to 10 men, it wasn't surprising that the visitors got a bit upset, especially one particular diminutive but highly volatile character from their coaching staff, who in the background seemed to be having verbals with somebody from the Aldershot bench, before even waving obscenities at the home director's box for good measure, as if it was their fault. It certainly resulted in Aldershot getting on top though, with keeper Preddy coming under fire from all sorts of distances, with Owen Cole almost catching him out from nearly 40 yards in the 52nd minute. In fact, Preddy was a bit unlucky when Aldershot went 4-2 ahead from the resulting corner, as he made an excellent point-blank save from Owen Cole's header before Joe Narty tapped in the rebound, with Walton and Hersham's defenders standing around like statues appealing for a non-existent offside. Of course, Narty was now on for his second successive hat-trick, and he missed it by a whisker in the 59th minute, as keeper Preddy badly misjudged a Colin Fielder free kick, but just got a finger to the ball to divert it away from Narty's head. Although the only two people in the ground who realised that seemed to be Preddy and Narty themselves, as a goal kick was given by referee Penton without any other complaints. Walton and Hersham though were still angry about that earlier sending off, but they were lucky not to have another player shown the red card in the 61st minute when Garfield Blackman committed a bad foul on Owen Cole and then appeared to gouge him in the face as well. But Blackman ended up with only a booking for that, even though it looked far more of a sending off offence than Dean Cannaville's misdemeanour. However, Aldershot made Walton and Hersham pay for that lack of discipline when they increased their lead even further as soon as play resumed, when Steve Tallboys floated over an excellent cross for Gary Abbott to send a perfectly placed header into the far corner. That put the shots 5-2 up, and that really got keeper Delroy Preddy annoyed, as while Abbott was celebrating, Preddy and Joe Narty were having a scuffle in the back of the net in trying to retrieve the ball, albeit off camera, but apparently serious enough for them both to receive a booking. Preddy though just couldn't stop complaining, especially as he was really being wound up by the home crowd laughing at him, so much so that his manager Mark Hill had to come right out of his dugout and stand behind the goal to sort him out. Of course, all this was providing great entertainment for the loyal Shot supporters who had preferred to brave the bitterly cold weather to come along to this game rather than sit at home and watch the various live football on TV in front of a warm fire. And indeed the 500 or so who chose the latter option missed yet another goal for the Shots in the 67th minute when Gary Abbott made it 6-2 with his second of the game, as he was left totally unmarked at the far post to head in a Jimmy Sagru corner. That goal suggested that Walton and Hersham had now given up, and with George Borg bringing on the fresh legs of Neil Champion and Leon Gutsmore for ageing veterans Colin Fielder and Gary Abbott in the 72nd minute, further goals looked even more likely, and indeed just seconds later Aldershot found themselves 7-2 ahead when Joe Narty almost inevitably completed another hat-trick with a cool finish after Ian Hathaway had mesmerised the opposing defence in his customary style. By now, George Borg had brought on teenage winger Sam Cobbett for what was only his second appearance in a home match, but the first game in which he'd had a chance to play on the side of the pitch in front of the family stand, which was where his fan club appeared to be, as the raucous lager-influenced chanting from the East Bank was now being drowned out by the sound of screaming women and children, making it sound more like an under-10s match than a Ryman League game, especially when Cobbett made a good challenge just before the end. Maybe that was because of his David Beckham hairstyle, which of course might lead to ridicule from opposing supporters if he doesn't perform, but Cobbett was unlucky not to earn the Shots a penalty in the very last minute when his cross was clearly handballed just inside the area by defender Alan Dowson, but referee Penton presumably felt Walton and Hersham didn't need any more punishment and therefore waved play on. Indeed, the final score of 7-2 was certainly more than Aldershot would have hoped for going into this match, but the controversial sending off of Walton and Hersham's Dean Cannaville right at the start of the second half no doubt had a bearing on the eventual scoreline, as the Shots were only leading 3-2 at that stage in what had been a very closely fought match. However, it was the sheer quality of Aldershot's delivery from crosses and dead ball situations which was the main difference between the two sides, as Joe Narty and Gary Abbott had a field day in getting on the end of them, and that gave the home crowd some fantastic entertainment, which caused one of them, namely PA announcer Tim Noyes, to get so excited he seemed to think he'd just woken up from a dream. With Aldershot having by far the best floodlights in the league, perhaps it did seem like a morning match compared to the facilities at some other grounds, and with the Shots having the best stadium and 3 times as many supporters as anyone else in the league, they would have expected to have been a bit higher up in the Premier Division table at this stage of the season. However, the obvious inconsistency that you've just witnessed on part 1 of this video meant that the Shots now had to win practically all of their remaining league games to have a chance of the title, while hoping to go all the way in the League Cup and the Hampshire Senior Cup as a consolation if they didn't win the league. So if you want to find out how they got on, make sure you purchase a copy of part 2 of this compilation for another 3 hours of great action and entertainment.